Chapter 959. Dad, Dad. A weak voice came from Dana's mouth. Her originally dull eyes suddenly became clear, filled with excitement, grievance, and a trace of relief. Tears flowed from the corners of her eyes. No one knew what kind of humiliation and torture she had suffered during this period of time. Compared to the physical pain, the mental trauma that Zaxi, Tay, and Jason had inflicted on her was the most painful for her. But she endured it. The reason why she had such tenacious willpower was because she knew that once Dean and the others succeeded, it would endanger her father's life. Even if she knew that Dean and the others were not her father's opponents, she wouldn't allow her father to be in danger. At the moment she looked at the strong man standing in front of her, she felt that everything was worth it. She had been waiting for this moment. Hearing Dana's voice, Jason and Tashi, who were roaring, froze on the spot as if they were struck by lightning. They turned their heads and looked past the muscular man at Dana, who was lying on the grass in front of him. After a long time, the two turned their heads stiffly. They looked at each other and slowly turned to Dean. They saw Dean gently shaking his head. There was a trace of coldness in his eyes. The two were startled on the spot. Their mouths were slightly open but they couldn't speak. At this moment they understood that Dana was not crazy at all. From the beginning to the end, Dana had been watching over their plans, and she had been watching over them. The two couldn't blame Dean. Their eyes were full of despair. Dad is here. The strong man squatted down and gently picked up Dana. It was as if he was holding a newborn baby. His face was full of gentleness. I'll take you home. I've finally waited for you. There was a sweet smile on Dana's face. She was a bit tired as she slowly closed her eyes and fell asleep. She had been working hard in the past few days and hadn't had a good rest. At this moment she couldn't support it anymore. The strong man gently kissed her forehead and looked at her tenderly. After a long time, he slowly turned around. The tenderness on his face had turned into indifference. His eyes fell on Jason and Zaxi, who were on the ground. Elder, I didn't do it. It was him. They did it. I tried to persuade them but they didn't listen to me. Zaxi's face was full of despair. He knelt towards the strong man and begged, please let me go. I'm willing to do anything for you even if I have to be a pathfinder. You! Jason was angry but at the same time terrified. He also crawled towards the strong man. Elder, it was his idea. It has nothing to do with me. I have a lot of information to give you. I know the flaws of the War God's wall. I also know the secrets of the Empire. Please let me go. I can be your subordinate and help you do anything. Both he and Zaxi knew that just crying and begging and showing an extremely humble attitude would not be enough to make people soft-hearted. In fact, it would only annoy them. But they wanted to tell the strong man as much as possible that they still had value and could bring help to him. The strong man looked at them expressionlessly. After a moment, he slowly opened his mouth. How did you hurt her? Seeing his question, the two seemed to have found a loophole and scrambled to answer. He attacked her and cut her in half. We were going to follow her to see you, but we didn't expect him to suddenly attack. We saw that he had done it, so it was obviously impossible to continue to see you, so we could only accompany him to the end. He did it. The strong man narrowed his eyes and looked at Dean, who was not far away. Dean was in a cold sweat but didn't open his mouth to defend himself. With the strong man's eyesight, even if they didn't say anything he would be able to guess a few things. A debt of blood must be paid with blood. I'll let you live but you can't escape punishment. The strong man's tone was gentle. He didn't have the anger and coldness that they had imagined. As soon as his words fell, a few strong winds swept past them. Zaxi, Tay, and Jason were slightly startled. The next moment, they felt a chill coming from their arms. The two turned around and saw that both of their arms had fallen to the ground, broken at the shoulder. The pain was like a needle piercing into their brain. Both of them screamed in pain but didn't dare to scream too loudly in order to avoid annoying the strong man. They had dominated the life and death of many people. Naturally, they knew what kind of scene they didn't like to see. The strong man's body didn't seem to move. Even Dean, who was watching him, didn't see how he did it. The strong man looked at both of them, who were grimacing in pain but didn't dare to scream. His eyes flashed a trace of coldness. He glanced at Dean, who was not far away. "Take them and follow me back." Then he turned and walked away. Dean sighed in his heart. He went forward to Zaxi and Jason's side. Both of them looked up at him. There was anger in their eyes, but they restrained themselves. They let Dean pick them up one by one. Their faces turned ugly as they looked at the arms on the ground. They wanted to ask Dean to help them pick up their arms, but they didn't dare to. As long as the arms were there, there was a possibility of healing. But since the strong man intended to cut off their arms, it was hard to guarantee that he wouldn't do something else if he saw them trying to reconnect their arms. Dean carried them to keep up with the strong man's pace while they were hesitating. There was silence along the way. Occasionally a monster would jump out of the soil and attack the strong man in front of them. The strong man didn't make any move, but the monster's body was broken. Blood sputtered and fell to the ground. Dean and others once again returned to the iron smelting plain. They passed through the underground mine and the underground furnace where they smelted iron and steel. The three of them immediately saw the footprints of the strong man and another pair of small feet. Obviously they had been here before. "Did you do this?" the strong man asked as he passed by the furnace. "I did it," Dudian said. "Do you know smelting? What did you do before?" The strong man's tone was flat. It seemed that they were just chatting. Dean felt that the man was moody, so he didn't dare to relax. "I studied tailoring and medicine. I know a little bit about smelting and purification." "You have learned a lot," the strong man indifferently said. "It's just a casual study," Dean replied modestly. Compared to the other abyssal demons who only focused on hunting and combat techniques, as well as magical creatures and politics, he was indeed rich in life skills. Moreover, he knew far more than that, although he did not say it all out. He wanted to keep some trump cards for himself. Although the situation was bad enough, who knew if there was any hope of survival? Zash and Jason's eyes were gloomy as they heard the conversation between the two. Dean was the mastermind behind the attack on Dana. Why were they the most miserable? On the contrary, Dean seemed to be fine. However, they could only think about it. They weren't stupid enough to complain to the strong man. Not long after, the few of them walked along the plain and arrived at the edge of the area. There was a barren mountain here, and the mountain was covered with jagged rocks. It was mainly made of sand and large rock. The burly man stopped and found a patch of sand. He reached his hand into the sand and pulled it up. The sand quickly slid down, and a black iron cover was lifted up. Inside was a pitch-black staircase that led deep underground. "Go in," the strong man said to Dean. Dean took Aisha, Jason and Zaxite into the room. They had the dark vision so they wouldn't stumble. With a creak, the muscular man walked in and closed the metal cover, blocking out the last bit of light. After walking down the stairs for about 20 meters, the stairs were no longer stairs, but a 2-meter-wide path. At the end of the path was a heavy iron door. Chapter 960. The brawny man passed by Dean and pressed on the wall next to the iron door. Dean had already seen through the wall that there was a hidden mechanism that connected bearings and lead wires. The iron door slowly opened as the brawny man pressed on the loose wall. There were sharp blades and poisonous arrows buried in the top and bottom of the iron door. If someone forcibly destroyed the iron door, then the mechanism would be triggered. It was still a dark world behind the iron door. Everything was hazy in the darkness, but Dean could clearly see that it was an extremely spacious room. There were sofas made of animal fur and fabric, tables, and rows of bookshelves and spacious tables. There were messy papers piled on top of them. In addition, there were several strange instruments in the open space of the room. Dean recognized one of them. It was a microscope. From the shape and the steel, it seemed to be from the old era. The brawny man touched the wall when he entered the door. Suddenly the room was lit up with a dazzling light. The color was orange. The light was soft and warm. Zashite and Jason were startled by the sudden light. Their eyes widened in shock. The strong man gently put Dana on a sofa and covered her with the animal fur blanket on the sofa. Then, he turned around and put the drooping girl on another sofa. When he bent down to put her down, he suddenly let out a soft cry of surprise. Dean's eyebrows twitched when he heard the man's voice but returned to normal. The burly man frowned as he stared at the girl. Her face was completely red, but it wasn't because she was shy. Instead, it was as if she had a fever. Her face was so red that it almost seeped out of her skin. Her eyes were tightly closed, and her brows were furrowed. He reached out his hand to touch her arm, and then reached into her clothes to touch her back, but he felt his hand was wet with sweat. If it was an ordinary person, then he would think that it was a cold or a fever. But who was the girl? How could she get a cold or a fever? The bacteria that caused the fever could be easily erased by her resistance. A look of contemplation flashed in the man's eyes. He suddenly thought of something and lifted the girl's eyelids. He saw that her eyes were bloodshot, and the ends of these bloodshot veins were faintly black. The brawny man retracted his hand and turned his head. His eyes fell on Dean. There was a trace of coldness in his eyes. Dean saw his expression and said bitterly, "You can't blame me. I just want to save my life." The brawny man looked at him coldly. His eyes suddenly swept to Aisha. "If I'm not wrong, if I didn't meet her, you would have used the undead virus to deal with me." Dean reluctantly said, "How could we? We wouldn't dare to do anything to you." "Really?" The brawny man sneered. "If you don't dare, then why would you come back here in a big circle?" Dean could only shut up. Since the strong man had already guessed it, there was no need to continue to hide. Whoosh, whoosh. Only the sound of heavy breathing could be heard in the silent room. The sound came from the young girl's mouth. Her chest rose and fell faster and faster, and her heart rate continued to rise. The blood flow in her body also sped up, which also caused her body temperature to rise rapidly. If one looked closely, they would find that between the gaps of her lips as she breathed heavily, her originally smooth and white teeth were gradually becoming sharp, like the teeth of a canine. Zash and Jason were bewildered as they saw the girl's appearance. The brawny man looked at Dudian. "I'll deal with you later. The three of you stay here and behave yourself." He picked up the girl from the sofa and quickly walked into the room. He opened another door and went in. Bang! The door was closed. The sound made Zash and Jason tremble. Both of them were like frightened birds. Zash was surprised after the brawny man left. "Is she infected with the virus?" Dean sighed as he threw them to the ground. "I met her on the road. I would have died if I didn't save my life. I was forced to protect myself." Zash and Jason looked at each other with bitter taste in their mouth. When they kidnapped Dana and tortured her, they had already touched the reverse scale of the strong man. Now his second daughter was also in their hands, and she was infected with the Walking Dead virus, which was irreversible. Her situation was even worse than Dana's. They didn't dare to imagine what kind of rage they would have to endure. The brawny man came out of the room. Dean saw through the door that the brawny man had sent the girl to. There was a huge cage in the laboratory. There were many other cages there, and many strange things were locked in them, including the undead. At this moment, the young lady had also become one of them. His mood was complicated. He couldn't tell if he was happy or disappointed, but he felt more disappointed. It was not because the strong man didn't care about his family. This had nothing to do with him, but because he had a trick up his sleeve. He was looking forward to seeing a glimmer of hope from the strong man, but he didn't expect that the strong man also seemed to be helpless against this virus. The brawny man went straight to the sofa and sat down. He picked up a towel and wiped his hands. He glanced at Dean, Jason and Zash. "Do you know why I didn't kill you?" The three of them were silent. Even if they had guesses in their hearts, they didn't dare to say it. The burly man wiped his hands and said casually, "Of my 2 daughters, one is injured and the other is infected by a virus. They are basically dead. One dead and one injured. This hatred is not enough to be resolved by just killing you." The 3 of them felt their hearts sink. Zash carefully said, "Elder, this is all because of him. He is the main culprit. We are at most accomplices. I am willing to do anything for you. I am absolutely loyal to you. I hope you can forgive my mistakes." He spoke in a very sincere manner. It seemed that he had become the slave of the brawny man. Dean was indifferent as he heard his words. There was no change in his expression. He didn't defend himself. The brawny man's eyes fell on Dean as if he didn't hear Zash's words. He slowly said, "You just need to do one thing for me. If you are lucky, then maybe you can survive." Jason and Zash's eyes lit up. Although they knew that it might be difficult, but they still saw hope. Hope can always cheer people up. Dean was silent like a stone. There was no expression on his face. "Sir, please tell me. I will definitely do my best," Zaxi Tay quickly expressed. "Me too." Jason didn't want to be outdone. The brawny man nodded. "I am lacking some abyssal-level experimental materials. The 3 of you stay here and accompany me to complete my experiment. I hope you can survive to the end." Experiment? Experimental materials. Chapter 961. Zaxi and Jason had more or less contact with the Monster Research Institute inside the wall. Naturally, they knew how terrible the experiments were. The brawny man said that he was going to use them as experimental subjects. Naturally, he was going to conduct human experiments or demonic modification experiments. The number of people sacrificed in these experiments was even more than the number of people killed in the war. However, most of the people used in these experiments were vagrants or poor people. So the impact on the peace of the entire godly wall wasn't that obvious. Dean's eyes were gloomy. He had a hunch that the robust man would use them as experimental subjects, but he didn't expect that they would be treated as experimental subjects. He remembered what Dana said when he interrogated her. Her father liked to do experiments. Now it seemed that it was true. Moreover, from the layout of the base, it seemed that the robust man's level of experimentation was extraordinary. "Elder, why don't we find other abyssal-level warriors for you?" Zaxi's desire to survive was very strong. "I can go to the God of War wall and lure the soldiers there to attack us. Then we can take the opportunity to capture them. We are defectors, so we won't go to them again. So you can rest assured and leave it to us." "Yes." Jason's eyes lit up. "With the 3 of us working together, we can lure a few abyssal demons over and capture them. If that doesn't work, you can just watch from the side and easily capture them. We can be the bait, and you will have an endless supply of experimental materials." He winked at Dean and signaled him to help persuade the robust man. Dean was silent and didn't speak. The robust man didn't wait for Zaxi to continue to speak as he raised his hand to interrupt them. "Of course, I have considered this point. But the aliens have just invaded the God of War wall, so they won't invade again for the time being. The soldiers on the God of War wall won't easily come down because of a few defectors like you. Even if they want to hunt you down, they will come in the form of a small team. But there is still you," Zaxi quickly said, as he was afraid that the robust man would dispel the idea. The robust man shook his head. "There are more secrets in the God of War wall than you think. Once I get close, I will be detected. This is the border of the Empire. Do you think that the sensors here will be so weak?" Zaxi Tay and Jason were stunned and speechless. They suddenly thought that the brawny man was hiding in the isolated land outside the giant wall. Most of them had the same identity as them. Either he couldn't stay in the giant wall or he was expelled. They were all wanted targets, so they didn't dare to expose their identity. If there was a chance, they could use this information to exchange for a chance of survival with the Battle God wall. However, the battle god wall would most likely not let them leave this place. My name is Beyond the Lookout. You can call me Doctor from now on. As for your names, I'm not interested. Just call me by number. You're number 1, you're number 2, and you're number 3. The strong man pointed at Zaxit, Jason, and Dean. He got up and went to the shelf next to him. He opened the drawer and took out 3 purple glass bottles. There was a purple liquid inside the bottles. Placing the 3 bottles on the table, Boluo glanced at the 3 of them and said, "1 bottle each, drink it." Zaxit and Jason looked at each other hesitantly. "Is this the experiment?" Zaxite asked carefully. Boluo's eyes turned cold. "Don't waste my time. I'll give you 10 seconds. Don't force me to start." Zaxite and Jason clenched their teeth and grabbed a bottle each. They unscrewed the cork and hesitated for a moment before closing their eyes and drinking the whole bottle. Dean also grabbed a bottle. His eyes lit up as he unscrewed the cork and poured it into his mouth. His throat slightly rolled. Putting down the bottle, Zaxite looked at himself and suddenly felt a little uncomfortable. Then, he felt a sharp pain in his buttock. He turned his head and saw nothing. Then, he felt as if all the blood in his body was rushing to his buttocks. Then, his blood suddenly flowed in reverse, and he almost spat out a mouthful of blood. When he managed to hold it in, he felt his limbs go soft, as if he had not slept for a few months. His whole body could not move, and his mind was in a mess. He could not even open his eyes. So tired. Zaxite's will could not gather and struggled, and he slowly closed his eyes. Plop! He fell down. Shortly after he fell down, there was another plop. Jason also fell down. Behind them, Dean's body swayed and softly fell down. Boluo looked on coldly. He coldly snorted, "Number 2 and number 3, the 2 of you, stand up." Number 2 was Jason and number 3 was Dean. Both of them didn't respond. Burrow slightly sneered, once again taking out 2 bottles of purple liquid from the drawer next to him. At the same time, he took out a copper syringe, stepped forward and grabbed one of Jason's arms, sucked the syringe into the purple liquid, and then injected it into their arms. Jason's arm trembled as the syringe was inserted into his arm. He wanted to struggle, but Boluo's knee suddenly pressed against his back. He was instantly pressed to the ground and couldn't resist. He groaned in pain as the purple liquid was injected into his body. Dean didn't think that Jason didn't swallow the purple liquid but deliberately imitated Zaxit's reaction and pretended to be unconscious. He didn't think that his and Jason's performance would be seen through. He thought that there was no problem with his reaction. Did the other side have the same X-ray vision ability as him? He slowly sat up while thinking. At this moment, Boluo had finished injecting Jason. He turned around and saw that Jason was sitting up. Boluo expressionlessly sucked the purple liquid into the syringe and grabbed Jason's arm to inject it into his blood vessels. Soon, Dean felt a sharp pain in his chest. It was the location of his magic mark. Then, the blood in his body seemed to concentrate towards his chest. His heartbeat was fierce and he couldn't breathe. But the next moment, all the blood seemed to evacuate, and then he felt extremely tired. He secretly clenched his teeth, but in the end, his eyes turned black, his brain buzzed, and he fell down. When his head hit the ground, he called out the only thought left in his mind. It sounded more like he was moaning in sleep. "Don't hurt her, I know." He didn't finish his words before he completely fainted. Boluo looked at the unconscious Dean and glanced at the motionless figure standing next to him. His mouth slightly curved. "Even if you didn't say it, I would have kept her. It's the first time I've seen such a strange corpse king." His limbs were cold. When Dean woke up again, he found himself in a dark cage. He was startled for a moment. He turned around but didn't see Aisha. He gritted his teeth and stood up. His limbs were soft, but he still stepped forward and grabbed the iron pillar in front of him. "Boluo! Boluo!" Roar! Roar! Hiss! Hiss! The response to Dean was a burst of beastly roars and strange sounds. Dean noticed that he wasn't the only one in this silent cell. There were 2 cages next to him and Jason. Both of them seemed to be in a comatose state. He also saw the girl who was infected with the virus, but at the moment she was completely awake. She was wandering in her cell. Her hands and feet were shackled like a walking corpse. His cry naturally alarmed the girl. She immediately rushed to the iron pillar of the cage, grabbed the iron pillar, and roared at Dean. Her eyes were pure black. Impressively, she had turned into a king of corpses. Dean was surprised. He noticed that there were other strange monsters in the cage next to her. At the moment they were disturbed by his cry. They struggled and hit the iron bars in the cage. This is the previous cell. Dean was startled. He found that his vision wasn't so clear. The light in the cell wasn't pure black. There were several electric lights on the walls. There were also several light bulbs hanging in the middle of the aisle. He could see the places where the light shone, but he couldn't see the shadows in the depths of the cell. Chapter 962. After a moment of experiment, Dean discovered that he had lost not only the dark vision but also his strength and magic mark ability. Right now, he only had his physical strength, which had been greatly weakened. He was probably only at the level of a pioneer. Without the splitter's magic mark, it was like the magic mark had been stripped from his body. But the magic mark on his chest was still there. He thought of the purple liquid that was injected into his body. It should be the thing that suppressed his magic mark ability. I don't know if it is permanent or time-limited, Dean thought in his heart. It was the first time he encountered such a magical drug that could make an abyss person lose his magic mark ability. Squeak! The door to the cell was pushed open, and the burly Boluo walked in. He snorted coldly, and in an instant, the entire noisy cell fell silent. The terrifying shadows in the cages trembled and stopped making a ruckus, curling up in the shadows. Only the young girl who was biting on the bars continued to growl, her pure black eyes filled with malevolence and brutality. Burrow looked at her and sighed. He walked along the aisle to the front of her cage and quietly looked at her. The girl reached out from the cage. She was full of bloodthirst. Burrow stared for a moment and slowly turned his head to look at Dean. "You know the way to control the undead, don't you?" Dean was silent and didn't deny it. It wasn't that he didn't want to cover up the secret, but he couldn't. Although Burrow looked rough on the outside, but he was meticulous. He would be able to see through Aisha's abnormality on the way back. After all, Aisha followed him like a shadow. This was a strange thing in itself. "Did you get this method from the Empire or from the ruins?" Burrow didn't directly ask about the method but asked about the source. Dean stared at him. "Where is she?" "She is very good." Burrow looked at him meaningfully. "Without your control, she seems to be just a puppet." "She's not a puppet," Dudian immediately corrected. "I said it seems to be," Burrow casually said. "She is not," Dean said in a deep voice. Burrow slightly frowned. There was a trace of understanding in his eyes. "Is she your lover? Or a relative?" "Well, I've seen a lot of people like you. In today's world, it's not uncommon to be infected with a virus. There will always be some people whose friends or relatives are infected with the virus, but they can't do anything about it. Even I can't change the people who are infected." At this point, a trace of pain flashed across the bottom of his eyes, but it was hidden very deeply and disappeared in a flash. Then, his expression returned to normal and continued. "However, you are the first person to be able to control someone infected by the virus. Even those despicable fools in the Empire couldn't find a way. If you want to live a better life, you can tell me the method." Dean was silent. Burrow also seemed to be very patient, quietly watching him, waiting. After a moment, Dean slowly opened his mouth. "This method is not unusual. It's just that you were focused on drugs and research and didn't think of this aspect." Burrow was interested. "Do you know about conditioned reflex?" Dean didn't hide the method. Although it seemed that mastering this method was his trump card, but he knew that even if he didn't say it, Burrow had a way to make him confess. For example, using Aisha to coerce him or using drugs to destroy his willpower. Although he thought that he was strong enough, but the reality could often easily break his stubborn shell. Many strong-willed people bowed their heads in front of drug addiction. Conditioned reflex? Burrow was startled but suddenly realized. He had studied biology for many years and naturally knew the most basic knowledge. At this moment he knew what was going on and couldn't help but laugh. I didn't expect that such a simple thing would be placed in front of us, but everyone turned a blind eye to it. What a conditioned reflex. Ha ha! Burrow couldn't help but laugh. But his laughter was full of ridicule. Dean didn't know if he was laughing at himself or others. When the laughter stopped, he looked at Dean with eyes full of appreciation. Using conditioned reflex to control the undead, you can really think of it. This training process must be extremely painful and difficult, right? Fortunately, Dean didn't show any pride or joy. He calmly said, "Compared to your research, this is just superficial. I've heard about cloning before, but never seen it. I didn't expect you to put this rumor into practice and be so successful. If you were still in the Empire, with this achievement alone, it should be enough to surpass tens of thousands of people, second only to the Seven Kings." Boluo raised an eyebrow, a cold smile on his face. "Even without this, I still stand above all others." Seven Kings? Heh, to think that I was also a king tier in the past, but… At this point, he frowned as if he had thought of something unpleasant. He stopped talking and didn't continue. Dean's pupils shrank as he listened to Burrow's words. Once a king? Bilelo was actually a king? Looking at Dean's incredulous look, Burrow coldly snorted. What's so strange about kings? They are just a group of cowards who are struggling to survive. What's ridiculous is that everyone thinks that they are great heroes. They worship and love them. They are willing to be driven around like cattle and horses. Ridiculous. His face showed undisguised ridicule, disgust, and contempt. Dean was startled. He was puzzled and asked, "Struggling to survive? They are the strongest existence among us humans. Do they need to be so humble?" When Boluo heard his words, he sneered but didn't say anything more. He just said, "Seeing that you're honest, I'm telling you this. It's also a reward for telling me the method to control the undead. As for the other things, you don't need to know. It's not something you can come into contact with. It's useless even if you know. An ant has an ant's life. They don't know the immensity of the heavens and earth. They can still live happily every day. Why think so much?" Dean was silent. In his heart, he wanted to say whether he was an ant or a dragon. How could he say it? However, when he thought about it, it seemed like it was really up to him. If he killed him now, he would really become an ant. An ant whose life was as worthless as grass in the wilderness. What was a mere abyss compared to the masses of living beings? It was just a star that had dimmed in the vast sea of stars. Who would notice it? Dean put away his thoughts as he saw Burrow was about to leave. He quickly stopped him. "Have you removed my magic marks? What kind of experiment are you going to use me for?" "It's not removal. What's the use of having you removed?" Burrow glanced at him. "But your current state is no different from having your magic marks removed. I advise you to be honest and don't try to escape. There are many traps here. Be careful not to lose your life." He turned and strode away. Dean was disappointed that Burrow didn't mention anything about the experiment. But he knew that Burrow wouldn't tell him. After Burrow left, Dean looked at Jason and Zaxit. "Did you hear that?" The unconscious Zaxite and Jason slowly sat up. Jason sighed and said, "It seems like we are really going to die here." This person was actually a king in the past. Zaxite's eyes were still filled with shock, and he said with lingering fear, "We actually tried to kill a king. We were crazy." Jason laughed bitterly. He suddenly thought of something and said, I seem to have heard that there was a king who betrayed the empire and escaped. Could it be him? Zaxi looked at him in astonishment. Where did you hear that? A wall lord. Jason didn't elaborate but sighed. Now we can only resign ourselves to fate. Zasha's face was gloomy. I should have followed Dana from the beginning. I wouldn't have been reduced to a prisoner. Dean glanced at him and said in a cold voice, "The other side brought us here just to save trouble. The other side has already planned to use us as his test subject. At least it's better than the current treatment." Zaxi angrily looked at him. He was angry with Dean, but Dean's strength was higher than him, so he could only swallow his anger and obey Dean. But at the moment they were prisoners, so he wasn't afraid that Dean would attack him. Moreover, Burrow had said that they didn't have any combat effectiveness. "Stupid!" Dean snorted. "It's all your fault." Zaxi gritted his teeth and looked at him. "Enough." Jason growled and stared at Zash. "What's the use of quarreling? Besides, duty is right. Didn't you see that the one in front of us is also his daughter? If he really has deep feelings for his daughter, he would have tortured us to death long ago. Even if there is value in keeping us alive for experiments, we can't avoid the torture. Living a life worse than death is unavoidable. If you want to blame something, blame it on us for fleeing in the first place. Should we wait for death? Aren't we going to die now? Who knew that it would be like this?" Oh, Dean sat back in the depths of his cage and looked at his broken left leg. He slightly rubbed the scar. Previously he relied on the demonized blade to support his left leg. But now he had lost his demonized ability and became a cripple. He often walked by the river until his shoes got wet. Compared to other hunters who often left the giant wall to hunt, most of them retired with a crippled body. He had been around for so many years, but he only lost one leg today. He was lucky. Chapter 963. The next day, Burrow came to the cell, opened the cage, and took Zaxi away. Not long after they left, Dean and Jason heard faint screams coming from under the floor. It seemed to be Zaxi's voice. Their faces turned gloomy. In the dark cell, Dean could only judge the time by the degree of hunger in his stomach. But he knew that the longer he stayed here, the more blurred his body functions would be. So he couldn't judge the time anymore. At about 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening, the cell was opened. A girl wearing a white dress pushed a metal cart and slowly walked in. Dean and Jason couldn't help but slightly change their expressions when they saw her face. It was Dana. But soon Dean found that this Dana wasn't the same person as the first Dana he met before. Although the appearance was the same, but there was a difference in temperament. He could distinguish it at a glance. Dean was silent as he thought of Burrow's cloning experiment. He didn't know how many Danas were in this underground base. The Dana in the white dress didn't seem to notice Dean and Jason. She pushed the metal cart and stopped in front of the first row of cages. She lifted the white cloth on the cart and there were 4 metal barrels inside. She opened the lid of one of the barrels. The smell of meat overflowed. The shadows in the cages roared, but they didn't dare to hit the bars. They saw her pick up a metal spoon from the cart and scoop out a spoonful of broth. There were a few pieces of fat floating in the bucket. She poured it into the stone trough next to the door of the first cage. The shadows inside couldn't hold back anymore. They rushed over and licked the broth. Dean and Jason, who had been hungry for a day, heard the sound. They couldn't help but salivate. The girl scooped 2 spoonfuls of broth and continued to push the cart to the second row of cages. The whole cell was filled with the sound of licking, swallowing, and chewing of bones. Glancing at Dean, the girl's expression was indifferent. She scooped out a spoonful of broth and poured it into the stone trough in front of Dean, and then added another spoonful. There were 2 pieces of cartilage and fat, and the meat was stained with black hair. The smell of meat drifted out of the stone trough. Being hungry for a day was not enough to numb Dean's taste. Looking at the meat soup and meat pieces that were half submerged in the stone trough, he frowned slightly and hesitated for a long time. Finally, he reached out and drank the meat soup. He grabbed the meat pieces and stuffed them into his mouth. He did not dare to taste the extremely strong smell of meat, so he chewed a few times and swallowed. When he ate a few pieces of fat meat with black hair on them, he felt disgusted, but he still pulled the hair off and ate it with a dark face. The taste was indescribable. Ever since he came out of the slums of Sylvia, he had rarely found food so hard to swallow. What is this? Suddenly, Jason's slightly trembling voice came from the side. Dean's heart tightened. He turned his head and saw Jason holding something under the light of the aisle. However, the appearance of this thing was too easy to identify. It was a finger. A human finger. Dean's pupils shrank. In an instant, he felt like his stomach was hit by a heavy punch. His stomach tumbled, and the gastric juices rushed to his throat. He covered his mouth and clenched his teeth. The veins on his face bulged and twitched slightly. Finally, he took a deep breath and swallowed the thing that had rushed to his throat and mouth. Then he felt like collapsing. He leaned against the iron bars and gasped for breath. After Jason saw it clearly, he vomited on the ground. After coughing for a long time, he slowly raised his head, shook off the stewed and swollen finger, and threw it into the cage next to him. The shadow that had finished eating the broth in the stone trough smelled the smell and immediately rushed over, picked up the broken finger, and ate it like enjoying a delicious meal. Dean's mind slightly moved as he saw this scene. The girl pushed the dining cart to the last row of the cell. After scooping out all the things, she pushed the cart back again. She saw Jason vomit on the ground and curled her lips slightly. It seemed like she was sneering, but she didn't say anything and left the cell. Bastard! As soon as the girl left, Jason punched the ground. His face was full of anger. Dean was silent, but his eyes were cold. Although they had killed countless people and seen countless limbs and internal organs, they had never thought of eating people. Especially eating people himself. This feeling was even more disgusting. It even made him feel that his body was being tarnished. After the anger, Dean and Jason fell into silence. The cell was very quiet. Only the snoring sound came from the other cages. It seemed that they were snoring in sleep. Dean's thoughts calmed down. He unconsciously thought of the finger in the broth. Whose was it? Was it Zaxby's or someone else? Or were they not the only ones imprisoned here? After a long, long time, Dean felt that it was noon of the next day, but he still didn't see Zaxby being brought back. The girl pushed the dining cart again, but this time it wasn't broth but weeds, mushrooms, and mushrooms. Dean's face turned ugly as he looked at the arm-long weeds, mushrooms, and 3 palm-sized mushrooms that were assigned to him. He couldn't help but ask the girl, "Can we eat this? Is it poisonous?" The girl handed the food to Dana, who had the same appearance as her. She glanced at Dean and said, "Don't worry, eat your food. You won't die. Dad still has a use for you." Dean was a little relieved. But looking at the raw mushrooms, as well as the weeds that could be seen everywhere outside, he felt that he didn't know where to eat. However, thinking that the broth might be sent in the evening, he bit the bullet and grabbed the raw mushrooms and ate them. "Why did you eat the broth yesterday? What kind of stew was that?" Jason suppressed his anger, but his tone was still not good. The girl indifferently said, "Anyway, it wasn't your hand. Why do you care so much?" Jason slightly gritted his teeth. When the girl walked past him, he quickly called out, "I haven't given it to you yet. Didn't you vomit yesterday? Since you are not hungry, there is no share for you today," the girl said without looking back. Jason was so angry that he almost died. He stared at her back with hatred. The girl suddenly turned her head and her eyes fell on Jason's line of sight. Chapter 964. By the time the girl left, Dean had finished eating all the mushrooms in his stone trough. The seemingly weedy grass was not as difficult to swallow as he had imagined. The taste was bitter, but it was not rough. It was easy to swallow after chewing it up. After eating, he leaned against the iron pillar and continued to be in a daze. Time passed quickly as he was immersed in his thoughts. When Dean felt a little hungry, the cell door opened again. It was the girl in the white dress. Her dress fluttered in the wind. Coupled with her quiet and beautiful face, she looked like an angel. The only thing missing was a pair of wings and a halo. The girl pushed the dining cart to feed the cage. Her dress seemed to flutter as she walked. 2 tiny shadows could be seen on her well-developed breasts, with a different kind of temptation. However, Dean's taste was biased towards maturity. He had no feeling for this kind of young girl, especially when he knew the true face hidden under the white dress. He felt even more indifferent and even disgusted. Just like yesterday, 2 spoonfuls of broth were scooped into the stone trough. Dean glanced at it and slowly moved closer to it. The girl continued to feed the other cages, but skipped Jason. After the girl left, Dean looked up from the stone trough. The broth in the stone trough was not reduced at all. He just pretended to lie on his stomach, lest the girl saw that he did not eat and cut off his lunch tomorrow. Although he was ruthless enough, thinking that today's broth might be cooked with human flesh mixed with monster flesh, he felt it difficult to swallow. He was still rational as long as he was not extremely hungry. "You don't want to eat?" A voice came from the side. Dean looked over and saw Jason licking his dry lips, looking at the stone trough in front of him. From time to time, a trace of heat flashed in his eyes. "Do you want to eat?" Dean looked at him quietly. The heat in Jason's eyes suddenly dissipated, as if he had sobered up. He hesitated for a moment and said with difficulty, I don't want to eat. I just want to drink some soup. I'm too thirsty. I was injured before, and my body is seriously dehydrated. Can you give me a little?" Dean was silent. After a long while, he slowly reached out and scooped up a handful of broth from the stone trough. He passed it to Jason through the gap between the iron bars. Jason looked at the broth in Dudien's hands. His eyes flashed a trace of complex color. He whispered, "Thank you," and slowly drank the broth faster and faster. Dean could feel his tongue licking the palm of his hand. It was wet and hot like a dog. He suddenly felt disgusted, but he didn't move his hand away. He just watched silently, his heart full of bitterness and anger as deep as the sea. He abandoned his dignity and lived a lowly life just to survive. Was this the fate of every life that was born to be tormented like this? If there really was a God, did he create life just to play with it? Thank you." Jason's words made Dean recollect his thoughts, and the deep anger gradually buried in his chest. Then he once again scooped up a handful of broth and handed it to him. Suddenly he felt like a lake in this mountain, occasionally splashed by the rain from the sky, but eventually returned to silence, as if nothing had happened. He was still looking up at the sky, reflecting its posture. Who was not like this among all living beings? Jason's hunger and thirst eased after eating 3 handfuls of broth. He resisted the urge to refuse as he saw Dean was about to give him more. He said thank you and turned back to the depths of his cage. He leaned against the wall and didn't say a word. Dean glanced at him, turned his head and picked up the rest of the broth, throwing it into the stone trough on the other side of the cage. The shadow in the cage was immediately attracted by the broth and rushed over to lick it. With the help of the light, Dean saw its appearance clearly. It was a wolf-like monster, but it had 3 tails. The hair on the tail was thicker, and at the tip of the tail was a sharp horn. Moreover, under its abdomen, there was a carapace-like fine strange limbs that coiled around each other. It seemed to be a hidden attack weapon. Soon, the monster finished licking the broth in the stone trough. It looked up at Dudien. Its green fluorescent eyes had a bit of human light. It let out a low roar. Dean smiled, grabbed the meat from the stone trough, and threw it over. The monster immediately caught it with its mouth and ate it. Dean gave it the broth and a few pieces of meat in the stone trough. After the monster finished eating, it still looked at Dean eagerly. When Dean said, "No more," it was still unmoved. Until Dean did not throw it anymore, it turned its head and shrank back to the corner. The next day, the girl came to the cell again and gave Dean and Jason weeds and mushrooms for lunch. "Where is our companion? He was taken out by your father. Why hasn't he come back yet?" Dean took the opportunity to ask her. "It's none of your business." The girl glanced at him and walked away. Seeing that he could not get any information, Dean frowned slightly, but did not ask any more questions. This continued for 4 or 5 days. Every day, Dean only ate weeds and mushroom vegetables at noon, and the broth in the evening was all given to the monster next to him. The monster, who had been eating his meat soup for a few days, had obviously changed its attitude towards Dean. When it had nothing to do, it would lean on the iron pillar next to Dean. Dean boldly reached out to stroke its hair, but it did not resist. "Look at your appearance, you are also an unlucky guy that was caught. Your body has been transformed into this strange appearance." After a few days of observation, Dean had seen the fine carapace tissue under the monster's abdomen. It should be from an aquatic monster or a sea monster. It obviously did not match the monster's body, but it still grew in its abdomen. The three-tailed wolf whimpered, as if it was responding to Dean. Dean sighed. He thought that Burrow knew about cloning and organ transplantation. He must have mastered a lot of technology from the old era. He did not know the reason why it betrayed the Empire. The next morning, the cell was pushed open. Burrow walked in with a tired face. He glanced at Dean and Jason. "You, come with me." He helped Dean open the iron lock of the cage. Dean was startled. He did not expect that it would be his turn so soon. He could not help but look at Jason. He thought that Jason would be in front of him. "Are you going to do an experiment?" Dean stood up and asked. Boluo nodded slightly. "What experiment?" "I have entered a relic from the old era. I found a lot of ancient books and learned some things. Maybe they can help you," Dean said. Burrow gave him a look and shook his head. "You wouldn't understand even if I told you. In terms of biological research on the human body, I've long surpassed the olden era. The information in the ruins isn't of much use to me. It really is laughable when I think about it. The olden era humans have developed for so long, their technology in other areas so advanced that it's unimaginable, yet they still haven't made any progress in the field of the human body. Even an organ transplant is a rather difficult experiment, let alone cloning or genetic modification." Dudian was startled. He didn't expect the old man to know so much about the old era. Thinking of the microscope, he suddenly realized that the latter was once a king. Judging from the size of the Shenluo Empire, how many relics were hidden in it? Burrow must have seen a lot of items in the relic. Although his understanding of the old era was not as good as Dean's, but it was not much worse. The environment is different. The focus is naturally different, Dean explained. The environment in the old era was comfortable. Not like now. We have to rely on our fists and feet to fight the monsters. So the natural development is different. Burrow looked at him with interest. "That's true, but the true reason is because of us humans, hypocrisy. The pedantic humans in the old era advocated the idea of humanism. Not to mention using the human body as experimental material. Even monkeys and orangutans with human genes would be banned from the experiment. How slow is the progress of the experiment under such circumstances? How much time does it take to change different materials and repeatedly adjust the experiment? There is no other way. If it was allowed to kill their compatriots, then they would have self-destructed." Dean frowned. Chapter 965. Maybe this is the difference between us and the monsters. Dean didn't argue with him anymore. "Do you want to research the power beyond the king by using the abyss as an experiment?" Burrow's mouth curved. "You aren't stupid. Come out." Dean stepped out of the cage and followed behind Burrow. "Do you want to become an origami?" "Origami?" Boluo did not turn around. He simply smiled and replied, "Although the origami are powerful, they have already broken away from their very essence. I do not wish to become something that is not even human yet. Otherwise, I would just be an honest king. Something that wasn't even a human? Dean was surprised. He thought of the nearly 10 meters tall figure of Aragami. It seemed that his previous guess was right. Aragami wasn't a human. Why do you care if your body is a human or not as long as your mind is still your own? Dean wanted to test his thoughts, so he deliberately said, "Our current posture should not be regarded as human, right? The mutation of the body is just a small matter." Burrow glanced at him. "But there are some things that can affect your thinking. For example, some magic marks can bring strength to the body, but it can also subtly transform the body so that the body likes fresh blood and meat. In the end, they can only eat monsters or humans. Perhaps they can't be called human when they are hungry, but they will return to normal thinking after they fill their stomach. Such changes can only be regarded as weak." Dudian was startled. He knew that although the magic marks couldn't directly affect the brain, but it could change the body. The changes in the body would affect the brain. It was like when the body smelled the fragrance of fresh blood, the brain's resistance to the blood would weaken. Slowly it would no longer feel disgusting, but would even feel delicious and sweet. So the Aragami can affect the mind? Is it the same for the king? Dean asked. Of course. The more you get, the more you will lose. As for what you lose, it varies from person to person. Some care about it and some don't. Burrow indifferently said, "But if you cherish something but you don't care about it after you become a king, then are you still willing to be a king?" Dean's heart was shocked. The first thought that came to his mind was Aisha. If his obsession after becoming a king was no longer to resurrect her, he even felt that she was irrelevant. Then what was the point of all his efforts? He suddenly felt that God was making a fool out of him. He was like an ant on a chessboard, thinking that he had taken the correct step, but little did he know that there was an invisible line under his feet. How many people, in the process of growing up, had long forgotten what they wanted in the first place? Perhaps it was like a fish in a ditch. After entering a large river, it could only move in the same direction with the waves of the river. It could not go against the current, nor could it change its course. It could only follow the current. Stop is the abyss, go forward, it's still the abyss. Dean muttered to himself, suddenly confused. Here we are. Burrow's voice brought Dean's thoughts back. After they left the cell, they passed through the spacious living room they saw at first, and then went down another corridor to the next floor. Biolillo pushed open the heavy door in front of him, and inside was a bright laboratory. The walls were made of pure white aluminum, and there were many instruments inside, as well as 3 hospital-like beds. Dean glanced around and saw Zaxby's figure lying on one of the beds. But at the moment, his appearance was very strange. In addition to half of his face that could identify his identity, his body was beyond recognition. There was a black thigh-thick tentacle protruding from his abdomen. It was like a very thick tail of a viper, gently swaying. His severed arms were connected to swollen tissues. They looked like 2 fat intestines. The surface was purple and exuded a fishy smell. Dean's heart slowly sank. He looked around the laboratory but didn't see Aisha's figure. Anger gushed out from the bottom of his heart. He gritted his teeth and said in a low voice, "Where is she?" "Who?" "Aisha. Is it the Corpse King?" Burrow chuckled. "It seems that you care about her. Don't worry, she is very good. I don't lack the Corpse King here, so I don't need to use her for experiments for the time being. Moreover, she is a bit different from the general Corpse King. She should be the descendant of the Witchers, right? This is a rare treasure. After I finish this experiment, it won't be too late to study her. If I can find something novel, maybe." He licked his lips and didn't continue. He went straight to a tall cross next to the laboratory and waved to Dean. Dean was a little relieved to see that Aisha was fine for the time being. But the latter's words made his heart colder. He knew that anger was useless. He restrained his killing intent and slowly walked over. It was a steel cross with shackles on it. It seemed to be used to fix people. The edges were stained with rusty blood. "Go up," Burrow said. Dean stood up. Burrow smiled. An obedient experimental subject like Dean was very worry-free. Unlike some experimental subjects who knew that struggling was useless but still wanted to struggle. It was a pity that he accidentally damaged them. Although he knew that Dudian was tactful, he still handcuffed Dudian and pushed a cart from the side. There were various tools and drugs on it. He took out a syringe and a tube of liquid medicine and injected it into Dudian. Dean immediately felt his body gradually numb and became unconscious. Anesthetic? Dean opened his mouth. He felt that his speech was a little rough and his tongue was a little numb. Although he knew that he was about to become an experimental subject and even his body would be cut open, he didn't know why there was not much fear in his heart. Perhaps he was mentally prepared when he was arrested. At this moment, he was curious about the anesthetic injected by Burrow. Burrow took off his fur coat and put on a dust-proof white coat. Like a doctor, he took out disinfectant from the cart and sprayed it on a pair of gloves as thin as skin. The air was suddenly filled with the smell of disinfectant. "You are not nervous." Burrow put on the mask and glanced at Dean. He didn't judge by Dean's expression but by his heartbeat and body functions. "I have done these experiments before, but I never thought that one day I would become an experimental subject." Dean continued with his numb tongue. "What is the difference between the abyss and the king? It shouldn't be based on the number of ice worms. Do you want to know?" Burrow stripped off Dean's clothes. Dean wasn't wearing the standard armor issued by the God of War's wall. The armor had hindered the transformation of his demonic body, so it had long been discarded. At the moment he was wearing an animal fur shirt and short sleeves. They were easily torn apart by Burrow. In the blink of an eye, Dean was naked in front of him. Then Burrow took out a silver knife from the cart. It seemed to be made of silver. After disinfecting it, he touched the abdomen of Dean's six-pack and slowly cut open the middle of the abdominal muscles. Dean looked at his body being cut open, but he didn't have too much fear. Perhaps it was related to the lack of pain. He said, "Of course I want to. Anyway, I'm going to die. It's comfortable to solve the confusion in my heart before I die." Burrow gently smiled and took a rag from the side. He sprayed an unknown liquid on it and slowly wiped it on Dean's cut abdomen. Soon the bleeding stopped. Chapter 966. Ice Worm King. Dean slightly raised his eyebrows. But then he thought about it. People had different ranks, kings, beasts had territories, and insects naturally had a king. Suddenly, he thought of the spaceship under the ice lake where the Arctic ice dragon lived. There was a strange insect at the core of the unknown substance that stretched out like a tree branch. Could it be the Arctic insect king? If that was the case, wouldn't he have missed the opportunity to obtain it? A chance to become a king was in front of him. What's wrong? Nervous? Burrow felt that Dean's heartbeat had suddenly accelerated. He looked at him with interest, his eyes deep. "Or have you heard of the Ice Worm King somewhere? Or have you seen it before?" "It's impossible to say that I'm not nervous." Dean pretended to be very indifferent, but at a glance he could see that he was deliberately pretending. "This is the first time I've heard that there is a king among the ice worms. It's very difficult to subdue the Ice Worm King. The strength of the Ice Worm King should be stronger than the abyss, right?" Burrow glanced at Dean and said indifferently, "It's slightly inferior to the Lord of the Abyss. But it's often surrounded by groups of ice worms. It's very difficult to catch it. Many Lords of the Abyss who had reached the bottleneck tried to catch the Ice Worm King, but they were careless and became the worm's food. So the road to the king isn't that simple." "Then why not ask the king for help?" Dean was curious. It should be known that the existence of the Lord of the Abyss must be the top of the empire. The empire was controlled by 7 kings, which meant that it was divided into 7 camps. There was no neutral faction that didn't join the king's camp. It meant that they would be the enemy of all the kings. So since there was a king who joined the camp, then it was naturally the best to ask the king for help. Once successful, they would become the new king, and it would also strengthen the faction of the previous king. Ask the king for help? Burrows sneered. If the king knew about the existence of the Ice Worm King, why would he share it with others? Is the king not the limit? It can continue to improve? Dean was surprised. Just like the abyss, the more ice worm kings it absorbs, the stronger it gets? Burrows sneered. Of course not. To us humans, the Abyss Master is already the limit. As for kings, who knows if they can even be considered humans? When they see the extreme ice insect king, they will only destroy it. To them, they only need one true king. Dean was startled and found it hard to understand. But aren't there aliens waiting for an opportunity outside the war god's wall? The stronger the empire is, the better. One more king means one more strength, and we can even completely expel the aliens. Why do we need to suppress them? Could it be that they were afraid of seizing power? But can't they think of other methods to control him? Obtaining a king as their servant should be a supreme glory and vanity, right? What does the outsiders have to do with them? Boluo sneered. Do you really think the outsiders can harm them? The world is so big. Even if the empire is destroyed, they still exist. If a king wants to escape, there should be no one who can stop him. Unless the origami that has already passed away is resurrected, but that is impossible. The origami have already gone extinct. Forget it, you won't understand even if I tell you this. As he spoke, he lowered his head and continued to dissect Dean's abdomen. He slowly removed a part of the intestines and organs inside. Dean's face turned ugly. First, because of Burrow's words, and second, because he saw his intestines being pulled out and cut. No matter how good his psychological quality was, he felt numb in his scalp and goosebumps all over his body. He was full of horror and fear. He turned his gaze away, no longer looking at his abdomen. In order to get rid of the image that lingered in his mind, he continued to ask, "You said that king tiers can no longer be considered humans. What is the reason for this? Could it be that their way of thinking has already been changed?" Almost. Burrow did not even raise his head. He was concentrating on what he was doing. Is there a big gap between the Ice Worm King and the Ice Worm King? Those who can become the king should be the best among the lords of the abyss. How could their thinking be changed? Is there no magic mark that is unaffected? Dean continued to ask. Anyway, he had become a fish on the chopping board. His life and death were unknown. He was not afraid of offending Burrow. Burrow was not angry. After hearing Dean's words, he glanced at him and said, "Who told you that the change of thinking is because of the magic mark? That is? The Ice Worm King is not only a nutrient but also an energy source for the evolution of the human body." Boluo said indifferently, "You should know how tenacious the life force of the extreme ice insects is. It surpasses all the creatures on Earth, and the extreme ice insect king has reached the extreme in this aspect. Apart from the high temperature of the sun, almost nothing can destroy it. Lightning, low temperature, crushing, all of them are useless. No matter how small the crushing is, it is still alive. It lives as a fragmented individual. When countless separated individuals get close to it, it will gather and be reborn. I have said it so clearly. Do you know the reason now?" Dean was startled. Suddenly, his face changed. Although Burrow did not say it clearly, he had already thought of the answer. Nothing could destroy it. This meant that the Ice Worm King was not like the Ice Worm King. It could not be absorbed by the human body as a nutrient for evolution. In other words, when the Ice Worm King was absorbed into the body as a nutrient, it was actually providing the Ice Worm King with the ovaries. The Ice Worm King would grow in the human body, and even divide and reproduce. No wonder Burrow said that the king might not be called a human. Thinking of this, he suddenly felt a chill in his heart. Could it be that the bodies of the 7 kings in the Empire were nurturing the Ice Worm King? Then was it themselves or the Ice Worm King that was controlling their bodies? If this was the only way to become a king, then wasn't it a road of no return to self-destruction? While Dean was lost in thought, Burrow had already stitched up Dean's abdomen and helped him to untie the shackles. He carried him to the bed next to the bed and took out the shackles to lock his hands and feet. Then he went to another cabinet and rummaged through it. There were transparent glass bottles soaked with all kinds of strange things. There were eyeballs, strange tongues, beating hearts, huge stomachs, and so on. Chapter 967. Is there no way to erase the consciousness in the extreme Ice Worm King's body? In that case, even if its body can survive, it will still be a pile of cells without consciousness. Dean thought for a moment and asked Burrow, completely ignoring the fact that the latter was grafting a piece of strange intestine into his body. Burrow didn't expect Dean to still have the mind to think about this matter. He looked up at Dean and said with appreciation, "It would be great if all the test subjects were as calm as you. It would save me the effort." Dean's gaze fell on the curved intestine in his hand. His face turned ugly as he looked at it. The intestine was black in color, like tanned skin, but there was a little golden light on it, as if it was smeared with golden sand. It was obviously not the intestine of a human. Even the organs of a normal monster wouldn't be like that. If I could erase the consciousness of the extreme Ice Worm King, I would have done it long ago. The experiment I did before was to study how to erase the consciousness of the extreme Ice Worm King while retaining the nutrients in its body. But I've tried everything and none of them work. The only way to kill it is the high temperature of the sun, but that will burn its body along with it. It's meaningless. Burrow lowered his head again and said while performing the operation on Dean seriously. Dean frowned and said, "Then how do you plan to surpass the king? Are you going to skip the extreme Ice Worm King and replace it with something else?" Burrow looked at him approvingly. "Smart. The only way now is to replace the extreme Ice Worm King with something else." He continued, "The undead you tamed is the body of a demon hunter. You should know that a long time ago, the first human evolution relied on the flesh and blood of monsters to enter the body and change the genes. Later, people found that the characteristics of the parasitic soul worm were more convenient and had greater potential than the demon hunter experiment. It was also easier to popularize, so the evolution method of the parasitic soul worm was implemented. The difference between these two evolution methods is that one directly transforms the body, while the other transforms the body to the parasitic soul worm. The latter is equivalent to installing a second heart in the body, which is the core to store power. Once the core is gone, the power will be gone too. On the other hand, if you want to increase the power, you need to strengthen the core. But the parasitic soul worm is also a life form, so there is a limit. The Lord of the Abyss is the limit of parasitic soul worms. If you want to improve further, you must create another core, and that is the extreme Ice Worm King. So, if you want to become a king with your own will, you have to find something else to replace it. For example, the origami or the flaming soul worm in the fire dragons. Dean heard his words and gradually understood. Do you want to use the eliminated Witcher's evolution method and combine it with the power of origami to surpass the king? That's right. Burrow smiled. This was the idea he was most proud of. Although many people in the Magic Creature Research Institute had thought about it and even experimented with it, they had never made any progress. However, he had already found an idea. I remember that your daughter, Dana, seems to have 2 kinds of magic marks in her body. One is the cold crystal soul worm of the Empire, and the other is the flame soul worm of this place? Dean looked at her thoughtfully, but her power doesn't seem to have reached the level of a king. She should be an incomplete experimental product, right? Burrow's smile disappeared when he heard about Dana. He said faintly, "Yes, they can only be considered to have completed 50%. If they can adapt to the origami gene, they should be able to surpass the king and become a new god. They may even be stronger than the origami. So, the experiment you are going to give me now is to inject the flame soulworm to reach their level and then inject the origami gene? Dean looked at him, but his face was a bit cold. Boluo said indifferently, "You can say yes and you can also say no." "What do you mean? Do you know why no one in the Empire has double magic marks?" Burrow didn't answer directly, but looked at Dean. "Such experiments are carried out every day in the Holy Court of the Empire, but there has been no progress. Soul worms have a strong exclusivity. A body can only have one parasitic soul worm. If you inject a second parasitic soul worm, then one of them will become food and be swallowed. The reason why I can complete the double magic marks experiment in their bodies is mainly due to the flame soul worm. This kind of soul worm is completely opposite to the cold soul worm of the Empire. They are incompatible like water and fire. In theory, they can't coexist in one body. But the wonderful thing is that they hate and reject each other, so they reach a wonderful balance between them. It's like a magnetic force. And the human body is this magnetic field. So, to achieve double magic marks, we must use the flame soul worm." Dean quickly understood and asked, "One ice and one fire. They melt each other and reach a balance. Has the Holy Court of the Empire studied this method?" It wasn't difficult to see from Burrow's words that the Holy Court was the Monster Research Institute. Burrow slightly curled his lips and sneered. "Of course they know, but what's the use of knowing? Those guys don't allow the existence of double magic mark. It means that there is a possibility of the birth of a power that surpasses them." "Not allowed?" Dean was startled, but then understood. Indeed, even if he was in a superior position, he wouldn't allow the existence of something that could endanger himself. "Can I become the king with double magic marks? Can I find the cold soul worm king and the flame soul worm king? If this is the case, then the birth of the king should be stronger than them, right? By the way, do you think that if they absorb the Arctic soul worm king and the flame soul worm king at the same time, will they be like the Arctic soul worm and the flame soul worm, canceling and restricting each other to achieve a kind of balance?" Dean's eyes lit up. Burrow was taken aback for a moment, then he chuckled. "You're quite talented in this aspect, but I've thought of this idea a long time ago, and I've even experimented with it. Unfortunately, it's not easy to find the ice insect king and the flame insect king, not to mention finding two and storing them at the same time. I've experimented twice, and both ended in failure. Either the ice insect king devoured the flame insect king, or the flame insect king devoured the ice insect king." Dean looked at him in amazement. Experimented twice? According to the calculation of 2 at a time, didn't it mean that he had used 4 cold soul worm kings? 1 cold soul worm king was equivalent to a key to the king's door. If it was used to create a king, then it could cultivate 4 kings. It must be known that there were only 7 kings in the entire Shenluo Empire. All of a sudden, Burrow's image soared in Dean's heart. Experimenting with 4 cold soul worm kings, this was a big deal. While Dean was stunned, Burrow continued to say, "Although the experiment failed, but the idea should be correct. If we can find 2 cold soul worm king and flame soul worm king with the same strength, maybe we can reach a balance. Then we can become a king with double magic mark. Moreover, they will have independent consciousness and won't be affected and disturbed. But it is too difficult." When he said the last 2 words, he couldn't help but shake his head. There was a trace of sadness in his eyes. Dean reacted and was about to ask, but then he woke up. Indeed, it was too difficult. Just finding 1 cold soul worm king was extremely difficult. It was like a peerless treasure. It all depended on luck, not to mention finding 2. Moreover, the strength of the 2 cold soul worm kings was exactly the same. This was equivalent to finding 2 people in a sea of people with the same physical qualities in all aspects. It was impossible to achieve in terms of the entire human population. After all, there were tens of millions of people with similar physique. But eyesight, hearing, vision, strength, fighting experience, and other factors that could determine the outcome of a battle were basically impossible to exist. Not to mention that the number of cold soul worm kings was very small. If they were a little stronger, they might be able to win in the battle for sovereignty. After a while, Dean felt a strange feeling coming from his abdomen. It was like a limp and numb feeling. But he was anesthetized, so he couldn't feel any other parts of his body. But there was a strange feeling coming from his abdomen. He looked down and saw Burrow lying on his abdomen. The light was too dim, so he couldn't see the situation inside the abdomen. He thought for a moment but didn't mention the feeling. He continued to ask, "Since you can't become a king with double magic marks, what are you going to do now? According to what you said before, there is no way?" Burrow didn't seem to hear anything. He was concentrating on the things in his hands. Dean saw that Burrow didn't answer. He also thought about it. He felt that if he could survive, this might be a problem that he would have to face in the future. After a long time, Burrow's voice came again. "Who said that double magic marks can't do it? Did I say that? I didn't say that the only way to become a real king is to have double magic marks." Dean recovered from his thoughts. He found that Burrow had sutured his abdomen. It seemed that the operation was over. He felt that his abdomen was hot. At the same time, the limp and numb feeling turned into an itch. He wanted to scratch it. It was like a piece of small ants were pinching his abdomen. Burrow wiped the sweat from his forehead. He took a towel from the car next to him and wiped his bloody hands. There was a relaxed smile on his face. "In the past, I directly implanted the double magic marks. This caused the magnetic field in the body to reach a balance. I couldn't inject any other energy to enhance my physique. A little bit of carelessness and the result was failure. But then I thought of a new idea." "What is it?" Dean asked subconsciously. "First, I implanted the power of origami." Burrow smiled. "I used the origami to replace the Worm King as nutrients. In the early years when I was working in the Holy Court, I found that the flesh and blood of the origami had a suppressive effect on the soul worm. In the past, I used to inject the power of the origami first and then inject the power of the origami. But this would disrupt the balance of the dual magic marks. So now I changed. I will inject the power of the origami first and then inject the second soul worm. In this way, when the first soul worm is suppressed by the power of the origami, it should join forces with the second soul worm to form a triangular magnetic field. In the future, as long as I continue to enhance the power of the origami in my body, my own strength will become stronger." Dean was startled. He trembled as he asked, Did you just implant the intestines of an origami into me?" "Smart." Burrow snapped his fingers. Dean was cold and angry. "Do you know that the vitality of the origami is more tenacious? Moreover, it will enter your brain. Although I don't know what will happen after it enters your brain, but it is likely that it will seize your consciousness." Burrow looked at him in surprise. "You know this?" Chapter 968. Dean once again experienced the taste of being slaughtered. He had swallowed a few pieces of origami's flesh to satisfy his hunger, but he had almost lost his life. It was too late for regrets. At this moment, half of the origami's intestines were directly implanted by Burrow. This was simply killing him. Although he guessed that the latter might have a way to suppress it, but what if the effect wasn't as good as he imagined? At the moment he didn't have the strength to stop the flesh from entering his brain. Burrow saw that Dudian didn't speak and didn't expect him to answer honestly. Even if Dudian told him, Burrow wouldn't believe it. What he saw was the truth. He immediately left the bed and went to the side to take out some tools and test tube. "Interesting. I'm getting more and more interested in your body." Burrow came to Dean and took out a brand new and clean green ring from a transparent bag. It looked like a jade bracelet, but its diameter was palm length. He used the scalpel to cut open Dean's neck. The anesthetic effect on his neck was weak. Dean could feel a slight pain and the feeling of Burrow's fingers caressing his neck. He had never experienced this feeling before. It was a wonderful feeling, but it also made him angry and scared. He felt his Adam's apple being pried open, and the flesh on his neck being peeled open under Burrow's fingers. Then, the vertebrae at the back of his neck were also moved, and for a moment, he felt like his head and body were separated. What a dexterous hand! This thought emerged in Dean's mind. He had to say that although Burrow looked burly, but he was more careful than a woman. If it was him, he wouldn't dare to guarantee that the experiment would survive after dissecting to such a degree. However, from this skillful technique, one could not help but conclude that he had done such experiments many times in the past. Dean couldn't make a sound after his Adam's apple was stroked. He looked at Burrow's face. He lowered his head and concentrated on his neck. He was busy with the operation. He could even see the pores on Burrow's face and the tiny dust particles inside. If he could enter the demon's body, then he would only need one blow to cut off his head. Dean thought silently in his heart, but his body could not move, and he was unconscious. The anger in his heart slowly calmed down, and the past slowly emerged in his mind. Only when death was right in front of him did he realize how much he longed for life. Burke finally raised his head and picked up the emerald ring from the metal frame. He gently pulled the ring and separated it into two sections. There was a hidden buckle in the broken part. Burke's eyes were dignified as he inserted the ring under the epidermis of Dudien's neck into the passage that he had previously been busy hollowing out. Ka! Dean heard the sound and saw Burrow sigh in relief. The next step was the suture surgery. 10 minutes later, Dean felt that his brain and neck were connected again. The feeling of fullness made him feel that lying down was also a kind of happiness. He opened his mouth slightly and asked, "What is this thing?" His voice was hoarse, and his Adam's apple trembled as he spoke. It was as if something was pressing against his Adam's apple. It felt cold and smooth. Burrow wiped the blood off his hands and let out a sigh of relief. He smiled and said, "This is a uranium ring, a natural element. In my many years of experiments, I found that uranium can suppress the origami factor. Although I don't know what method you use to suppress the power of the origami in your body, but just to be safe, I still put a uranium ring on you. This way, the origami factor in your body will not go to your brain. It will only be sealed in your body and slowly assimilated by your body. Then, you can activate it during battle and it will become your strength." Uranium element? Dean was startled. His mouth slightly twitched as he thought of the emerald color. He didn't doubt Burrow's words. When it came to uranium element, one had to think of nuclear fuel and nuclear weapons. Since the discovery of the uranium nuclear fission phenomenon, uranium element had been listed as an important rare element by major powers. During the 2 years he was the Lord of the Wall, he also tried to find uranium. But there was no uranium ore in the giant wall. He didn't know where the uranium ore came from, so he couldn't find any. Uranium element can inhibit the origami factor. Is it because of its natural radioactive radiation? Dean's face slightly changed as he thought of the characteristics of uranium. If this was the case, then wouldn't his body be the first to suffer? He saw that Burrow didn't want to elaborate, so he immediately changed the wording. If this thing can inhibit the origami's power, then can it also inhibit my power? In his opinion, implanting uranium crystal into his body was simply an act of courting death. In the long run, his neck would ulcerate. Even radiation would change the body's functions and cause sterilization, tumors, deformities, and other conditions. "Don't worry, I naturally have my reasons for doing this." Burrow smiled. "When the dual magic marks are implanted into your body, the magnetic field of ice and fire energy will help you offset the radiation of the uranium ring. It's strange that the soul worm is afraid of the origami's power, but the origami is afraid of the uranium radiation. The soul worm has a strong resistance to the uranium radiation. When the dual soul worm is in your body, it will make you immune to the uranium radiation, and even immune to most of the radiation in the outside air. Even if you go to the deepest part of the devil's pit and get swept away by the dark nuclear storm, you will be safe and sound. Dean's pupils shrank. This was the first time he heard the word nuclear from someone else's mouth. After a moment of shock, Dean quickly reacted. Previously, Burrow had already said that he had read a lot of books from the old era, so he had a more detailed understanding of the old era. So it wasn't strange for him to know about nuclear radiation and nuclear weapons. Now, let me take a good look at your body. Burrow slightly licked his lips as his eyes looked back and forth at Dean's body, as if he was looking at a fine work of art. Dean felt unnatural under Burrow's gaze. He felt like he was a naked beauty. But he knew that Burrow didn't have any special hobbies. He just wanted to explore the secret of restraining the origami's power. Burrow took a pair of forceps from the side and took a bit of flesh from Dean's abdomen, the frozen right arm and shoulder, and the temple. Then he took them to the other side of the laboratory and looked at the instrument similar to a microscope. Dean looked at his back as he felt the numbness in his abdomen spreading more and more. He knew that it was the factor that was emitted from the intestines of the origami that was eroding his body. He asked, "The size of the origami is huge. Which part of its intestines did you transplant for me?" Burrow didn't respond as he was concentrating on adjusting the microscope. Dean looked around and saw that Zaxit had woken up on the other bed. But he was still pretending to be asleep. Dean shook his head and winked at Zaxit. Dean knew that he wanted to wait for an opportunity to attack. However, Burrow wouldn't give them such an opportunity. Dean sighed in his heart as he looked at the white ceiling. He felt that time was unbearable. Since he had nothing to do, he asked Burrow again, "Did you make all these instruments yourself, or did you bring them over from the ruins?" Burrow didn't hear anything. Dean continued to ask, "You have defected from the Empire. The 7 kings should hate you, right?" Still silence. "Were all your previous experimental subjects clones of your daughter? Do you know where the fire dragons came from? Are there only 7 kings in the Empire? Did any of them die in battle?" Dean had a lot of questions, but Burrow didn't respond to any of them. Dean didn't care. Anyway, he felt comfortable as he could make some noise to disturb Burrow. Chapter 969. How old are you? Dean was stunned when he heard Burrow's words. After a few seconds, he finally realized what he was asking. He was shocked and asked with a face full of doubt, "Are you referring to age? How old are you?" Burrow asked again as he stared at Dean. Dean was uneasy, but he quickly replied, "This, I can't remember clearly, but it should be about 22 years old, right?" Ever since he left Sylvia, he really hadn't calculated his age. He didn't know how many years had passed in the wilderness, so he could only roughly feel how much time had passed. 22? Boluo narrowed his eyes. "It should be 322, right?" Dean's heart shrank and beat fiercely. He was confused. "What did you say?" Bielelo gave him a deep look, got up from the apparatus, and slowly walked over. "I didn't expect you to be hiding such a secret. Now that I think about it, 300 years ago just happens to be the time when the catastrophe happened. You should be someone from the old era, right?" "Old era? What are you talking about?" Dean was at a loss. Bolo's lips curled up slightly. "Although I don't know how you survived, and you're still just a small lower abyss after living for so long, your body doesn't lie." "How interesting. I didn't expect to meet someone from the old era, and you're so weak. If I had known, I wouldn't have been in such a hurry to use your body for experiments." Dean's heart completely sank. He knew that he could no longer hide it. The latter extracted his flesh and blood on the instrument and seemed to identify his physical condition. However, He couldn't understand. His body was completely frozen in the freezer, but his body was still in the state of 20 years old. How could it identify his frozen age? Suddenly, he woke up. Although he was in a frozen sleep state, but time wasn't static. It was like the frozen meat stored in the refrigerator. It could still identify the storage time of the meat. It could be seen that the microscope-like instrument used by Burrow wasn't a simple microscope. 322 years old man from the old era. Burrow came to the bed. There was a bit of excitement in his eyes. He looked up and down at Dean as if he was a rare protected animal in the zoo. Zaxi, who was pretending to be asleep, heard Burrow's words. There was a trace of shock in his eyes as he looked at Dean, who looked like a young man. 322 years old? Old era man? He suddenly felt that his brain was not enough to process all of this. At this moment, his rich life experience seemed a little ignorant and ill-informed. Dudian felt uncomfortable under Burrow's stare. He could only remain silent. He knew that he might be dissected from the inside out. He would be completely hollowed out by Burrow. As expected, after observing for a while, Boluo said, "Tell me, how did you manage to survive? You've lived for so long, yet you're so weak. I'm really curious about your life experiences." Dean's mouth twitched. After a moment of silence, he slowly said, "There is an instrument called freezer. I don't know if you have heard of it." Freezer? Burrow's eyes lit up. Is it the icehouse where the remains of the origami are stored? Almost. And then, Dean looked at him. Sleeping in the freezer will stop the body's functions. As long as the energy of the freezer continues, then you can sleep. I have been sleeping for 300 years. He didn't intend to hide the matter of the freezer. First, the freezer was useless to him. Second, even if Burrow got it, it wouldn't have much impact on him. It was just an instrument to hide from the world. Sleeping in the freezer for 300 years can bring you back to life? Burrow looked at him strangely. Do you think I'm a 3-year-old child that can be so easily fooled? Dean raised his eyebrows. You don't believe me? At least as far as I know, freezing can keep the body in the same state as when it was alive. But it can only be used to store dead things. Once a living thing is frozen and its heart stops beating, it is equivalent to death. Even if it is thawed, it can't be resurrected. Do you want to use this to test it and then take the opportunity to escape? Burrow ridiculed. Dean was speechless, but soon he thought that the freezer he was sleeping in was completely different from the general freezer. Burrow obviously understood the freezer as a freezer. He sighed and explained, "It's true. The freezer and the freezer are two different things. Although they are both frozen, but the freezer is specially made for living people. When it is thawed, it will stimulate your heartbeat and bring you back to life. I don't know the specifics, but what I said is true. If you don't believe me, then you can find it and study it yourself." "Where is it?" "In a divine wall called Sylvia." Boluo sneered and said, "In that case, I have to cross the battle god wall first and then find this god wall before I can get your so-called cryogenic chamber?" Dean sighed. "Why is the truth more untrustworthy than lies? You don't have to say any more. I have a way to check if what you said is true or false." Burrow waved his hand and left. Dean's face turned ugly. "Are you going to torture me?" Burrow didn't respond as he pushed the door open and went out. "Fuck," Dean cursed. His face was full of anger. As a suspicious person, he naturally knew how difficult it was to gain trust. Just like when they caught Dana, they didn't dare to believe her words if they didn't use all the torture methods. No matter how sincere she was, they didn't dare to believe her words. Only when they pushed her to the extreme, or even drove her crazy, would they feel that her words were credible. However, he became a prisoner in the blink of an eye, just like Dana at that time. He had witnessed all the torture that Dana had endured from the body to the soul. He naturally didn't want to see such a thing happen to him. Especially the mental torture. Burrow knew his weakness. It was Aisha. He didn't want to see such a nightmare happen. He felt that he would absolutely go crazy if it really happened. Anger, powerlessness, hatred, violence. He even wanted to destroy everything. But in the end the weakness from his body made him want to die. Chapter 970. Dean was filled with anger and fear when the door of the laboratory was pushed open and Burrow came back. Behind him came the sound of footsteps. Dean's heart was in his throat. But the next moment, he saw that the footsteps behind Bolo weren't Aisha's but Dana's. However, this Dana was different from the Danas he had seen before. She had a cold temperament and wore a scarlet robe. The girl's cheeks were immature but her eyes were deep and full of majesty like a queen. Dean was relieved, but then frowned. He didn't say a word as he watched Burrow come closer. Don't try to resist. She will enter your dream and read all your memories. Burrow condescendingly looked at Dean. All lies will be debunked and all secrets will be solved. Let me see how the world was destroyed 300 years ago. Dean was startled. Enter a dream? While he was in a daze, the scarlet-red-robed young woman, Dana, had already taken a step forward with an indifferent expression, and then she stretched out her slender little hand to press onto his forehead, causing him to feel a wave of icy cold and soft feeling. Then Dean saw her arm began to change. Dark liquid oozed out from the pores and spread all over her hand. The originally cute little hand instantly turned into a sharp spider leg with fine hair attached to it. Magic mark ability? Dean was surprised. Suddenly his forehead hurt. It was like a sharp needle was piercing into his forehead. It was slowly piercing deeper and deeper as if it was going to pierce through his head. Dean's expression twisted uncontrollably. Then he felt numbness on his forehead. It seemed that something had entered his brain. His clear vision instantly blurred and shook. The girl and Burrow turned into multiple afterimages. Then the world slowly darkened as if he had suddenly fallen into the abyss. He didn't know how long he had fallen. It seemed like a few minutes or a few hours. Suddenly a ray of light appeared. The light slowly expanded and a crack appeared in his vision. The silver-white light was reflected in his line of sight. It slowly became clear and showed a complete picture. It turned out to be an elliptical metal shell. What a familiar metal shell! Dean's consciousness murmured. Dean suddenly turned to the side and saw a few mottled buttons and a finger-thick bar-shaped display screen with 3 blood-red numbers. 300. Dean was shocked as if he was struck by lightning. This familiar number, familiar button, wasn't this the first thing he saw after waking up in the freezer? It was the numbers above that let him know that he had been sleeping for a full 300 years. The next moment, Dean saw an extremely pale little boy sitting up in the freezer. He looked around blankly. After a long time, the little boy plucked up his courage and climbed out of the freezer. When he opened the door, he was greeted by rotten and smelly junk. The junk collapsed from above and poured into the freezer, almost crushing him. The little boy vomited on the spot because of the smell. The thing he vomited was the breakfast he had before entering the freezer. After vomiting, the smell of vomit in the air became even more unpleasant. The little boy clenched his teeth and pushed away the garbage. Like a mouse in a stinky ditch, he climbed out of the garbage. His clean body had long been dirty. Then he saw a low and shabby refugee shed. The little boy stood there in a daze for a very, very long time. Only after a very, very long time did he take a step forward. His incomparably weak body swayed as he slowly walked towards the refugee shelter. His back gradually merged with the barren and dim environment. Dean was completely stunned as he looked at this scene. Wasn't this him? Memories seemed to roll in at this moment like a tidal wave. His gaze followed the little boy's body and slowly moved forward. He saw the torrential rain washing away the dirt on the little boy's body. He also saw the little girl in a purple chong sam appear in the rainy night like a fairy. Her porcelain-like, exquisite face was especially dazzling in the dark night, flashing in the thunder. Then he saw the little girl pick up the little boy who had fallen in the mud. She led him to a dilapidated eaves and handed him a meat sandwich. The rain stopped. The little girl wiped the water off his body and took him to an orphanage. She left the handkerchief to him and floated away. The little boy stood alone in front of the orphanage. Eventually, he slowly walked in and lived in the orphanage. He silently learned the language, silently endured the ridicule, silently observed the world, silently watched the children in the orphanage torture and kill stray cats and dogs, silently listened to his companions talk about the tragic fate of some of the adopted children. Then, it was his turn. Between the gardener and the doctor, he chose the woman with the beautiful smile and followed her home. Then he was sent to study. He was caught by hunters to identify his body. He was sent to Scavenger's special training camp. The scenes of the past flashed before his eyes like flickering lights and passing shadows, including the hunting outside the giant wall. Accidentally obtained the first magic mark, the Defiler. There was also the first love that was full of beautiful fantasies. After it was broken, the dark and dim cage, the disappointed eyes, and the desperate crying in the corner, Dean's heart trembled. He had long sealed the beautiful memories of that failure in the deepest part of his memory. He did not want to touch them. Even after he became the Wall Lord, he did not look for her again. But at this moment, all these memories were playing in front of him. When they were in love, the warm eyes, the gentle tone, evoked the softness in the deepest part of his heart. But eventually, it was broken with the final farewell. He looked at the boy who was tortured in the prison. He looked at the boy who was silently planning to escape from the prison. His heart gradually calmed down. The past was the past. His mind also calmed down. There was a faint expectation in his heart. He even hoped that the memory would be omitted as soon as possible. After a long time, Dean finally saw her again. It was the first time they met outside the giant wall. She was wearing a purple cheongsam. She was like a blooming epiphyllum. That familiar voice once again echoed in his ears. He felt a wet and hot liquid slide down to his face. The touch was very real. If I had made the phonograph earlier, it would have been better. Dean thought painfully and regretfully. He had made so many things, but the phonograph and the vintage camera were the only things he had not taken the initiative to make. These two things were not that technologically difficult to make, but as non-military magic items, they did not bring him much profit, so he had ignored them. But how many beautiful things could be preserved in the world with these two things? Sometimes when he looked at the road ahead, he would always ignore the beautiful scenery on both sides of the road. Wasn't this a kind of sad? The memory continued until he once again saw the sad figure in the beast tide. Dean's blood once again trembled and solidified. It seemed that all the blood in his body was cold. He wanted to roar, but his mouth could not make a sound. He was like a bystander who could only witness this scene. He could only look at the desperate figure of the boy holding her, but he could not help anything. He suddenly hated the boy. If he was a little stronger, then all of this would not have happened. As the memory passed, Dean's mood once again changed from grief to numbness. He looked at the scene behind him with a blank expression. The invaders had attacked, became the Wall Lord, left the giant wall of Sylvia, went all the way to the north, met Amelia Tribe. The last memory stayed in Burroughs' laboratory. The girl reached out her hand and pressed her forehead. The memories from his slumber came to a full stop. His line of sight still stayed on the last memory. It was like the video was stuck in the middle of playing. Dean was silent. In his heart, he slowly guessed what the magic mark ability of this queen-like Dana was. He felt that the latter should have seen all of his memories. His secrets were all laid bare in front of her, and he did not hide any trump cards. This was the first time that he was completely exposed in front of the enemy. His heart was completely cold, and even a little depressed, but thinking that Burrough did not intend to use Aisha to force him, his heart could not help but rejoice and comfort. He didn't know how much time had passed. Suddenly, the stuck memory quickly reversed. It was like playing in reverse. In the blink of an eye, he once again returned to the scene when he was lying in the freezer. Then the little boy in the freezer closed his eyes. The world was dark. The darkness seemed to last for a few minutes. The little boy opened his eyes again. He saw 3 faces that made Dean's heart tremble. Father, mother, and sister. This was the last picture he saw when he entered the freezer. The picture was still in the form of fast rewind. Dean's eyes could not keep up with it. Then, the image suddenly paused and stopped. The picture stopped was a snow-white ceiling. Then Dean saw a middle-aged man bend down and get close to him. At this moment, it seemed that he had returned to the first person's point of view. The middle-aged man's cheeks were a lot younger, but he recognized at a glance that it was his father. Then he saw his father holding him. His face was full of joy. He also saw his own chubby little hand. Is this the memory of when I was born? Dean thought in his heart. He felt a burst of warmth and nostalgia. He basically didn't remember the things that happened when he was 1 or 2 years old. He even forgot the things that happened when he was 3 or 4 years old. Only a few events left a deep impression on him. But at this moment, with the magic mark ability of Dana, these dusty memories were dug out. So he clearly saw the things that happened after he was born. Perhaps this was an unexpected surprise? Looking at his excited father, he couldn't help but reveal a smile on his face. Chapter 971. Dean looked at his middle-aged father in confusion. His memory at this moment was different from the memory when he woke up 300 years later. He couldn't hear anything. It seemed that his hearing was blocked when he was born. But even so, he had already practiced the ability to read lips over the years. He could understand what his father said through the shape of his lips. However, there was one sentence that made him wonder if he had read it wrong. Were they words with the same sound? But Chinese was particular about pronunciation. Even if they were words with the same sound, there would be subtle changes in the lip. When he was puzzled, his father turned around. His line of sight also changed. He saw a gentlewoman in a white gown with a virtuous temperament. It was his mother. At this moment, his mother's face was also full of smiles. She said, "Yes, we finally succeeded. Great." Dean read her lips and was slightly stunned. Combined with the previous words of his father, he suddenly had some fear in his heart. Soon, he suddenly noticed one thing. His mother was not lying on the delivery bed, but standing in front of him with her clothes intact. Was this not the time when he was born? He was a little confused as he saw his mother take him from his father. She held him in her arms, but she held him low. She could only see his chest and a little bit of his neck. She couldn't see his face, so naturally, she couldn't see if he was talking or what he was saying. After hugging him for a while, his mother gently placed him back where he had been lying and kissed him on the forehead. Looking at her face full of joy, Dean suddenly felt that he should be thinking too much. His mood was good again, and his heart was full of warmth. At this time, his mother turned her head and said to his father. From his angle, he could just see the upper bodies of the 2 people and the ceiling above their head. "I haven't named him yet. What do you think?" Mother said with a smile. His father slowly calmed down from the excitement. He touched his chin and thought for a moment. Then he said, "How about Adam?" "Adam?" His mother was stunned for a moment before bursting into laughter. "Isn't this name too tacky? Those foreigners always like to copy the Bible in their movies. If that's the case, shouldn't you be called Jehovah?" Dean nodded in his heart. "Adam? Are you kidding me? How tacky is this?" His father laughed and scratched his head. "What do you think we should call it then?" Dean slightly grinned, thinking that his mother was more reliable. Then he saw his mother's lips move as she said, "How about Pangu? Pan-gu?" Dean almost fell to the ground. "This name is a little too eye-catching. Let's change it." His mother quickly changed her mind. She also felt that the name was a little too arrogant. It seems like a little. Father nodded, thought for a moment, and suddenly turned and walked out of Dean's sight. Dean's mouth slightly twitched. What do you mean by as if? It's either Adam or Pangu. Can't you come up with a more normal name? After a while, his father reappeared in Dean's line of sight. He didn't know where he got a book with a black cover. The cover was protected by a layer of transparent plastic film. The cover of the book was somewhat tattered. Dean saw his father flipping through the book with a dignified expression. After 10 minutes or so, he looked up and said, "How about Andy?" Dean's mouth slightly trembled. "Are you always calling me the wrong way?" "Andy." His mother was surprised. "It seems to be a foreign name. What does it mean?" In Aslan language, Andy is a fallen god. Although it is the name of a great devil, but the original meaning is divinity. Father closed the book and slowly said, "I hope that our child will have divinity in the future and benefit mankind." Mother shook her head slightly. "No, this is the name of a fallen god. How can we use it on our child?" I remember that Aslan language is similar to English. In English, God means dog. Andy is spelled in reverse. What does it mean? Spelled in reverse. Father was surprised. He opened the book again. After a moment, he seemed to be relieved. He laughed. "Then we will call him Dean. It means light in Aslan language." Light? Mother thought for a moment and then nodded. "Yes, I hope that our child will act in an open and upright manner. He will never be tarnished. He will be like the sun that shines on everything." "Good." Father made a decision. "Then we will call him Dean." The two discussed and decided on the name. Dean, who was reading lips, stared blankly and couldn't speak. He didn't expect that his name would contain such meaning and expectation. Open and upright? Shine on everything? There was a trace of bitterness in his mouth. He thought that it would be better to call him Andy. At least he conformed to the meaning of the word, fallen. Was divinity really light? After his parents finished discussing the names, they left together. After they left, Dean saw a transparent cover slowly fall and cover him inside. Time flew by. Every day after that, his father and mother would come to see him. They would kiss him and sometimes hug him. The strong fatherly love and motherly love made Dean burst into tears. He was touched, sad at the same time. He thought of his father's expectations and mother's advice when the warehouse was closed. They hoped that he could survive, and if he had the ability, he would continue the human race and be a hero of mankind. He had gradually forgotten about this when he was a hunter. Time would always make people unconsciously forget some precious things, but this time, he clearly remembered it once again when he recalled it. But the sea of bitterness is boundless. There is no shore to turn back. After about half a year, when his parents came to visit him again, he felt that he could hear a weak voice. It was as if his hearing had just developed. This made Dean happy. He once again heard the familiar voice of his father and mother. It was like a warm spring that flowed through his heart. He suddenly felt that it was a good thing to be interrogated by Dina. "My body seems to be very weak. I have to stay in here every day. I can't even walk down the road." Dean looked at his parents leaving again. There was some regret in his heart. From the communication between his parents when they came to visit him, he also learned that his body couldn't leave this breeding room. Sometimes he could feel that his young body was extremely weak and it was difficult to turn over. Chapter 972. In the breeding room, young Dean spent most of his time in hibernation. Sometimes when his parents came to visit him, he was woken up by the noise. He opened his eyes and went back to sleep. It seemed that he would never be able to sleep, until one day, Dean heard a gentle knocking sound coming from outside the transparent glass of the breeding room. He opened his eyes and saw a little girl with delicate features. Judging from her eyes and lips, it was his sister. There was a long-lost sense of familiarity in Dean's heart, but soon his eyes closed. The young Dean just glanced at it and went back to sleep. Dean smiled bitterly in his heart. Day after day of intermittent hibernation, time flew by. Dean could feel that young Dean's body was getting stronger and stronger. He was able to get up and sit in the breeding room by himself. Until one day, his parents came to open the breeding room. They picked up young Dean and taught him to walk. After a few falls, the young Dean barely learned to walk. Although he was staggering, his parents were already very excited. His mother said, "Dean can finally walk. Great. I thought it would take a few more years. After all, he is already 3 years old. Although his development is poor, it is not too late." His father hugged his mother and comforted her. Dean silently remembered in his heart. 3 years old. So, he had been in the breeding room for 3 years. At this time, his parents took young Dean out of the laboratory. When they walked to the door, Dean suddenly wanted to look back and see what the breeding room he lived in for 3 years looked like. Unfortunately, the young Dean went straight out and didn't look back. The pictures he saw were just memories of his childhood, and he could not control them. After leaving the laboratory, Dean quickly saw his sister. The little girl who was like a jade carving before was now 6 or 7 years old. She was dressed like a pink princess and looked very cute. Dean's eyes were gentle. He wanted to reach out and pinch her. Only then did he realize that the proud and aloof sister was so cute when she was a child. "This is your sister, Du Xiaohua. This is your brother, Dean." His mother introduced them to each other. Dean looked at this warm scene and suddenly felt that it was good to stop time. But soon he thought of Aisha and remembered that he was in the underground base of Burrow. His mood suddenly became gloomy. Time slipped away. In the blink of an eye, little Dudian grew up to 7 years old. In the past 4 years, he had been sent to an aristocratic kindergarten to study, and his performance was outstanding. Although his physical fitness was still very poor, he had already displayed the intelligence of a genius. The teacher taught simple math problems that other children could not understand at all, but he only needed to listen to it once to understand it. He had only been in kindergarten for 2 years. When he was 5, he was sent to a place called the elite youth class. There were only half-grown children there, and the oldest was only 7 or 8 years old. However, the knowledge taught there was already at the level of a 3rd or 4th grade primary school student. Little Dudian kept up with his studies and his grades were getting better and better. Other than going to school every day, he would follow his sister to play video games, play hide-and-seek in the laboratory, or sneak out of the laboratory to secretly watch his father and other researchers do experiments. The cold laboratory was his home. Moreover, he did not feel that this place was deserted. Everything was so beautiful and warm. Until one day, his father told them that the laboratory was going to move. Then they migrated back to their motherland from abroad. After they migrated back, Dudian and his sister's studies were naturally interrupted. His father and mother did not sign them up for a new school. The 2 siblings had nothing to do at home every day. They played and played video games. Later, little Dudian found that his sister became dull and played less and less with him. Until one day, little Dudian, who was playing games on the TV, suddenly saw his sister rushing over. Her face was full of panic that he had never seen before. She grabbed the remote control in his hand, took out the game card, and jumped to the normal channel of the TV, a sports channel. However, this sports channel did not even broadcast the evening news. But at this moment in the afternoon, it was changed to the news broadcast. A video was playing on it. It was like a video clip from a science fiction movie. A strange spaceship fell from the sky, broke through the clouds, fell to the ground, and appeared in various countries around the world. The beginning of the catastrophe. Looking at the picture on the TV, Dudian's heart suddenly trembled and tightened. When he was sent to the freezer, he knew that this was the beginning of the disaster. At that time, Dudyan, who was more than 7 years old, was also scared by the video on the TV. At a glance, he could tell that it was not a movie special effect, but the real world. If it was another child, it was estimated that they would mistakenly think that it was a special effect. They would be fascinated by this majestic picture and feel excited. But at that time, Dudyan was confused, and then he saw fear on his sister's face. Fear was like a virus, it would spread and contagious. Since that day, Dudyan had never seen his sister smile again. The smile seemed to be taken away from the faces of his father and mother. There seemed to be an invisible cloud shrouding the family. At the age of 7, Dudyan also transformed like an insect in this oppressive atmosphere and quickly matured. Every day they would stay in front of the TV to watch the breaking news from all over the world. At that time, all the channels seemed to be occupied by the news. There was no TV series, no movies, no cartoons, no entertainment programs. As soon as they turned on the TV, they saw the disaster scenes from all over the world, the construction of majestic shelters, and the meeting and discussion of the leaders of various countries. Dudyan was also silently watching the news broadcast. Although he had seen it when he was young, but after all, he was only 7 years old. Even if he saw it, he couldn't understand many things. He only remembered the disaster scenes and some shocking shelter blueprints. At the moment, when he was recalling the news, Dudyan saw the content of the discussion of the leaders of various countries from the news content recorded in his memory. Biological weapons, thermal weapons, missiles, all the means of human attack were used on the invading monsters. These monsters were all human beings with distorted bodies. They had been unrecognizable, but they were not undead, but extremely strange creatures. Although the missiles could destroy these infected, strange humans, but often killed a lot of people, and more people would be infected. There seemed to be invisible dandelions floating in the sky, floating into more people's bodies. As more and more monsters were infected, the line of defense of various countries shrank again and again. But even so, in just half a year, the face of the earth had completely changed. In the end, the leaders of various countries proposed the ultimate plan: nuclear destruction. Chapter 973. Dean wasn't able to witness the nuclear explosion as he was sent to the freezer. His memory ended as the freezer slowly closed. His line of sight was plunged into endless darkness once again. Dean's heart was filled with sadness as his parents' faces appeared in his mind. His past life had passed in a hurry. Where was his future? A tingling sensation suddenly came from his forehead. Dean instinctively felt that he had regained control of his body. He was no longer in the previous unconscious state where his soul was wandering. He immediately opened his eyes and saw the first ray of light. In a trance, it was as if he had woken up from a deep sleep in the freezer. But the girl's face made him sober up. At the same time he saw Burrow, who was waiting for him in front of the sickbed. "How is it?" Burrow looked at the girl, who released his hand and asked. The girl nodded slightly. "No problem." "That's good." Burrow heaved a sigh of relief and asked, "How is it? Is what he said true? Is he really someone who survived 300 years ago?" "Yes." The young lady's expression remained calm and indifferent. She nodded slightly. "Through the dreamscape, I flipped through his memories. He is someone from the old era, and when the calamity erupted, his parents sent him to the freezer that he spoke of. He had been in a deep slumber, and when he woke up, he was already in the current era. He woke up in a desolate divine wall where his strength was generally low. From a poor commoner, he climbed to the position of a wall lord. Strictly speaking, it should be considered as usurpation. Right now, he has left the divine wall he was in and was preparing to head to the Empire. In the end, he was captured and sent to the Battle God Wall, participating in the previous battle. She summarized Dean's life in a few words. She didn't elaborate on the details, as she probably felt it was irrelevant. "So that's how it is." Burrow's eyes flashed. It seems that the kid is tactful and didn't lie to me. Is the God's wall far from here? Is the freezer still there? The God wall is in the south, some distance from here. The freezer is still there, but it's out of energy. Even if we get it, we can't use it. With the technology we have, we can't produce the energy needed for the freezer. The girl said calmly. Boluo was a little regretful. Whether or not it can be used is secondary. It's a pity that it's too far away. Otherwise, I could study it. If something were to happen in the future, perhaps I could use it as a life-saving item or plant a spark. When it appears several hundred years later, perhaps the world will have undergone some wonderful changes. The girl looked up at her father. Dad, as long as your experiment is successful, you can certainly live for hundreds of years or even immortality. This thing is useless for you. Burroughs smiled and said, That's true, but this freezer can freeze a living person for hundreds of years and still maintain their vitality. The core technology inside is extraordinary. Perhaps it will be useful for my experiment. Should I move it? The girl thought for a moment and asked, It's too dangerous for you to go to the giant wall alone. Let's talk about it later. I'll wait until my experiment reaches a bottleneck. It won't be too late to think about it then. Tell me about what happened 300 years ago. At that time, the Earth seemed to be very beautiful. What happened that led to all these changes? He was about 8 years old when he went to the freezer. Most of the time he was locked up at home and school. He didn't know much. The girl slowly said, but from what he saw of the world at that time, it was similar to what was described in those ancient books. At that time, there were no such fierce monsters on Earth. The strongest monsters on land were the lions and tigers mentioned in the books, but these monsters were small in size, and ordinary hunters could easily kill them. Really? Boluo leisurely looked forward and said with a sigh, What a beautiful world. Unfortunately, people are always lazy amidst such beauty. Is this considered cheap? The girl didn't answer his sigh. She continued, The world at that time was the same as what the ancient books said. The Earth was dominated by humans. We were the rulers of the planet. Although we didn't have any racial enemies, the countries of the world had civil wars to maintain population balance. Where there are people, there will be struggles. That's inevitable. Burrow faintly smiled. He seemed accustomed to this kind of thing. He was sleeping in the freezer. Was it because of the disaster? The girl nodded. This disaster was the same as what you speculated in the past. It came from outer space. In the words of the old era, it was alien invasion. At that time, the human countries didn't have the ability to resist. In the end, they chose to detonate all the nuclear weapons hidden in their countries. They were destroyed together with the alien races. Only some people hiding in the underground shelters were left. No wonder we found so many remains in the ruins. What a pity. Beyond the look outside and then frowned. So you're saying that the gap in the middle is still unknown? The girl nodded. Burrow sighed again. I was hoping to find the truth of the founding of the empire through his memory. It seems that this wall was created by the origami. He suddenly thought of something and asked the girl, Were the invading alien races the origami? The girl shook her head. He was too young then. He didn't know much. He only saw the spaceships that carried the alien races. He never saw them with his own eyes. However, the alien race's ability was to infect humans and turn them into monsters. From this point, it doesn't seem like the origami. Also, the alien spaceship was similar to the one you brought us to before. Similar to that spaceship? Boluo suddenly understood. So, the alien invaders were the Arctic bug and the flame bug. Strange, aren't they natural enemies? Why did they come to Earth together to attack us? The girl thought for a while and said, Maybe they worked together for a short time? Maybe. Burrow didn't deny it. He knew that the Frost Bug King had extremely high intelligence and wasn't inferior to humans. After asking about the old era, Burrow changed the topic to the origin of Dean's cold arm and how to restrain the origami gene in his body. The girl answered fluently and narrated Dean's experience. He accidentally obtained a magic mark of the Defiler. With the help of this magic mark's superior resistance to other magic marks of the same level, he directly absorbed the unpurified extreme cold soul crystal, causing the cold air to invade his right arm and freeze it. Originally, the freezing would have continued to spread throughout his body, but when the signs of freezing appeared, he burned his arm with flames and accidentally suppressed the cold air in his right arm. Therefore, unlike other infected people, it was not a full-body infection. Later, he became the Wall Master and left the Wall to go to the Empire. On the way he met the survivors of the old era in the wilderness. It was a secret tribe. He met the origami that they worship. He was hungry, so he ate the flesh of the origami. It didn't take long for the flesh and blood of the origami to recover. It was about to invade his brain, but he strangled the flesh and blood of the origami. Later the flesh and blood of the origami drilled into his cold arm and was frozen. Then it slowly became honest. That's it? Burrow was stunned as he heard the girl's story. The girl nodded. That's it. Burrow's face was strange, but he didn't doubt her. He turned to look at Dean. It's really ruthless to resist the origami by strangling the throat. I think his neck was almost broken at that time. Dean didn't say a word as he looked at him coldly. You're quite lucky to be able to control the origami without the help of any external equipment or medicine. It's a miracle. If it were anyone else, they would have been doomed to die the moment they ate the origami's flesh. Be on the lookout, praised. He then turned to the girl and asked, Is there anything else? No. The girl shook her head. Chapter 974. What's wrong? Burrow noticed Dean's gaze and narrowed his eyes. Dean looked away and indifferently said, Nothing, I just suddenly thought of her magic mark ability to peek into my memory. I don't know the effect of using it on the undead. Can it awaken the memory of the undead? The suspicion in Burrow's heart faded away. Interesting idea. You are worthy of the people of the old era. Your thinking is more flexible than the idiots of this era. Unfortunately, although the ability can peek into the memories of the undead, it can't awaken the memories of the undead. To be precise, most of the well-preserved undead have complete consciousness except for those with incomplete brains. But they can't control their bodies. Memory is like a piece of data and the body is just a carrier. They don't have the authority to control it. They can only be bystanders. Dean's pupils shrank. Do you mean that the undead still have memories? But they can't control their bodies? Yes. Burrow was in a good mood. He was happy to communicate with Dean, a human from 300 years ago. You can think of the undead as a machine. I remember there was a technology called camera in the old era. The undead is like a camera. It can take pictures of the scenery. But it is a dead thing and we need to control it. For the undead, we are the ones who control the shutter of the camera. We are the virus in their bodies. Dean stared at him blankly. Suddenly, his heart was burning with hope, and his eyes were shining. He could not help but say, So, as long as we find a way to cure the virus in their bodies, they can regain control of their bodies? Impossible. Burrow decisively interrupted Dean's fantasy. First, the virus can't be cured. There should be nothing more terrible than the undead virus in the world. I don't know if it should be classified as a germ or a toxin. In short, as far as I know, there is nothing that can drive the virus out of the corpses. There is no such super antibody. Second, even if it is cured, the undead without the virus is just a dead person. Their memory cells will gradually weaken and die. They can't be read. Dean was startled. He couldn't help but ask, Why? Boluo smiled faintly. Haven't you heard of souls? I'm not talking about the unrealistic undead that the Magi in the Empire are talking about. I'm talking about the source of life. To put it simply, it's our consciousness, but it's more complicated than that. Perhaps it's a kind of natural energy in the universe, or perhaps it's a kind of life magnetic field. When life dies, this kind of energy dissipates along with it. As for memories, they're just data that exists in the brain. They're completely meaningless, just like gears. Although they can move, they've lost the most basic kinetic energy. In the end, they'll only rust and decay. Soul, Dean murmured with a pale face. In just a few words, his mood climbed from hell to heaven, and then fell into a deeper hell, so deep that there was no hope. He thought he could find a way to cure the undead in the divine kingdom, but now it seemed that there was no answer he wanted there. Soul, what an ethereal and remote thing! It was so far away that no one dared to believe its existence, but at the same time, it was impossible to deny its existence. He had prepared for the worst. Even if he couldn't find a solution in the divine kingdom, he could borrow the more advanced technology in the divine kingdom and the knowledge from the superchip to find a way to cure Aisha. But Boluo's words were like a heavy punch to his heart. Even the most advanced knowledge from the old era recorded in the superchip couldn't reach the level of soul. Boluo seemed to know what Dean was thinking as he looked at Dean's ashen face. He chuckled and said in a playful tone, "It's not entirely impossible for you to cure the undead king. As long as you can survive my experiment, you can get a long lifespan and even reach the point of immortality. With such vitality and painstaking research, it's not impossible to find a way in hundreds or thousands of years. Of course, the premise is that you have to survive." Haha. Dean's quiet heart suddenly came back to life as he heard Boluo's joking words. Yes, the technology in the superchip couldn't reach it, but it didn't mean that there was no way. There was no end to technology. If he could learn the technology in the superchip and continue to develop it, then it's not impossible to find the existence of soul. He was excited again as he thought of this. He took several deep breaths. Boluo was surprised to see Dean's hope reignite. He didn't expect Dean to be so persistent in his belief. It was just a teasing sentence, but Dean took it seriously. He smiled in his heart. This wasn't a bad thing. At least a test subject filled with confidence and hope was better than a test subject with a dead heart and a crestfallen head. "Did you say that you can live forever after completing the experiment?" Dean calmed down again and couldn't help but look at Boluo. The topic of longevity had been around for thousands of years. It was the eternal pursuit of almost all life forms. However, there was a limit to the number of times a cell could divide. As the number of divisions increased, a person would gradually age, and their bodily functions would gradually weaken. If one wanted to live forever, they could only imagine it in theory, and it would be full of loopholes. Burrows slightly raised his chin, and a hint of enthusiasm and pride flashed in his eyes. "If the experiment is completed, although I can't say that I'll be immortal forever, it's very likely that I'll live for thousands of years or even tens of thousands of years. Of course, being killed by external forces doesn't count. However, at that time, no external forces can kill me unless the Earth is destroyed." Boluo's words were full of confidence. Dean thought of Boluo's previous goal of surpassing the king and becoming a god. He understood that Boluo wanted to become a legend and be immortal like a god. But was it possible? "Well, you rest first. I have something to do." Burrow raised the automatic movement watch on his hand and looked at the time. His expression converged, and he recovered his indifferent attitude. "As I said before, don't move and don't get out of bed. Otherwise, I don't mind cutting your beloved corpse king a few times to study it." He turned and left. The girl glanced at Dean and silently followed him. Chapter 975. After an unknown period of time, Dean felt that his body gradually regained consciousness. The burning pain also came from his abdomen, and his brain became a little swollen. It seemed that a lot of things were suddenly stuffed into his brain. He reluctantly raised his hand and rubbed his temples. He felt sore and swollen like a tired muscle. Could it be that after reviewing the entire memory, the amount of his memory had doubled? Dean's mouth twitched as he thought of something. He asked Zash, who was pretending to be asleep, "How long did I sleep?" Zash slightly opened his eyes. "What do you mean?" "She used her ability to read the time in my memory." "Oh, about half an hour or so." Half an hour. Dean was startled. Although he expected it wouldn't be too long, he didn't expect it to be so short. In just half an hour, he had seen his entire life. Suddenly he thought of something. If Dana used her ability to read his memory, she could use the time gap to do other things. Wouldn't she have dozens or even hundreds of times more time to think than others? Although his mind had been following the memory, but he could still think about other things. If there was a complex problem that he couldn't figure out, then wouldn't he be able to think about it in that state? He suddenly felt that Dana's magic mark ability was simply terrifying. It could be used for auxiliary purposes to exaggerate. If he were to practice fighting in the memory space, he would probably become a fighting master in just a few days. Such an ability should belong to a top 5-star legendary monster. Is she really a dream breeder? Dean murmured as he thought of Burrow's words. His heart was full of desire. If he could get such an ability, then wouldn't he be able to read Aisha's memory? He could meet her in her memory and listen to her voice and smile. He slowly recovered his calmness. The most important thing at present was to escape from here. But how could he get out? He thought of the sturdiness of the underground base, Burrow's strength and his own state. He fell into silence. Was the world 300 years ago really as clean and beautiful as the bards sang? Zaxby's voice echoed as Dean was lost in his thoughts. There was a bit of longing and curiosity in his voice. Dean glanced at him. "Do you still have the mood to think about this? Anyway, what else can I do?" Zaxby laughed at himself. Dean was silent. Zaxby looked at Dudian. "If his experiment is successful, then you should be stronger than him." "Do we have a chance?" Dean shook his head. "If the experiment reaches that step, he will definitely have a way to subdue me. He won't be stupid enough to create a monster that he can't control. This is a mistake made by low-level alchemists." Zaxby's eyes darkened and he smiled bitterly. "That's true." Dean frowned slightly. He felt that the pain in his abdomen was getting more and more intense. The numbness seemed to converge into a ball, like a worm with many feet crawling in his body. Wherever it passed, there was a slight feeling of needles. This feeling spread to his neck. Dean couldn't help but raise his hand to strangle his neck, but suddenly the needles quickly retreated and retracted back to his abdomen. Dean suddenly thought of the uranium ring on his neck. His mood was a bit complicated. He didn't expect that this thing could resist the erosion of origami. Squeak! At this time, the door of the laboratory was pushed open without warning. Dean saw Burrow's figure appear at the door. There were 3 figures standing behind him. All of them had the same face as Dana. But they were dressed differently. The scarlet-robed Dana was among them. The other Dana was the one who fed them food. The last one was wearing rough animal clothing. Her skin was slightly dry. It seemed that she often did physical work. Burrow's face looked very gloomy. Dean's heart skipped a beat. Did he make a mistake in the experiment? Just as he began to tense up uncontrollably, Burrow walked over and gestured to the white-robed Dana beside him. Dana nodded slightly and stepped forward to help Dean. "Come with me." "What's wrong?" Dean asked. The white-clothed Dana rolled her eyes and said, "You're still asking? It's all your idiot's fault for exposing us." Exposed? Dean was startled. He immediately felt relieved. But he didn't dare to show too much joy as he saw their faces were not very good. He wondered, "How are we exposed? We didn't send a message to the War God's wall. We are all deserters. You can ask her if you don't believe me." She was referring to the scarlet-robed Dana. "Of course I know you are deserters. Idiots," white-robed Dana said in disgust. The battle armors that the Battle God Wall distributed to you all are equipped with tracking devices and hidden pinhole cameras. All of your actions will be captured by the military's system. To put it bluntly, they have long since considered the possibility of deserters. The reason why they didn't chase after you all is because they treat you, who think you are infallible, as chess pieces for them to scout ahead. This is much easier than training death warriors. Dean was stunned. There was a monitoring device on the armor? They had been silently monitored for a long time? He suddenly felt a chill in his heart. This was too ruthless. Wasn't this considered recycling trash? Don't dilly-dally. Get up. Dana pulled Dean up. Although Dean had regained consciousness, his body was still soft and powerless. He could only lie on Dana's body like a puddle of mud. Dana showed a more disgusted expression, but she didn't push him away. It seemed that she was afraid of hurting him and destroying Burrow's most important experiment. How did you know? Dean subconsciously asked as he was dragged to the other side of the laboratory. His thoughts were still stuck on the matter of exposure. The white-robed Dana snorted coldly and said disdainfully, "Of course it's because I'm smart enough to discover the secret on the armor. Fortunately, I discovered it early. Otherwise, the enemy might have snuck over quietly one day." Dean suddenly thought of Zaxi. His own armor had been discarded, but Jason's and Zaxi's armors were still on. After all, the quality of the armor was still good. Zaxi's armor was naturally stripped off during the experiment. Then Dana would study it and find out the secret inside. After connecting the dots, Dean calmed down. At this time, he saw that he had been taken to a corner of the laboratory by Dana. There was an instrument that looked like a frozen warehouse, but also like a metal coffin. He quickly asked, "What is this?" Chapter 976. Dean fell into the metal cabin. He felt that it was very soft and comfortable. He didn't know where Burrow got it from. "Don't make a sound. Behave yourself." Dana put her hand on the cover of the metal cabin. She lowered her head and fiercely said to Dean. She swung her arm and closed the cabin door with a bang. Dean's eyes quickly swept over as the cabin door closed. He saw Burrow and scarlet-robed Dana moving the laboratory equipment. Are they going to move their position? Dean was startled, and his vision darkened. The sound outside seemed to be closed as the cabin door closed. It was dark and silent. Dean could only hear his own breathing and heartbeat in the narrow metal cabin. He thought of Dana's words. His heart was full of expectations. If the people from the God of War's wall saw Burrow through the monitoring system, would they recognize him? Would they send a large number of strong people to intercept him? The answer was obviously yes. This could be seen from how Burrow wanted to move as soon as he sensed the urgency of the matter. He was also afraid. Perhaps this was a chance for him to survive? He secretly prayed in his heart. He moved his body and put his ear to the metal cabin. Soon he heard a very slight collision sound. It seemed to be the sound of equipment being dismantled. There seemed to be friction on the ground. In addition, he faintly heard a miserable roar. The roar was somewhat familiar. Dean couldn't help but think of Zaxi, who was lying on the bed next to him. Was he resisting? No, he should be dead. The screams didn't continue. Dean guessed that Burrow didn't intend to take Zaxi along with him. He didn't want to leave Zaxi behind to be investigated by the pursuers. So he killed Zaxi. Dean sighed in his heart. At the same time, he was a bit glad. Fortunately, he was fine for the time being. It didn't take long for Dean to feel the metal cabin being lifted. His body also tilted. It seemed that he was being dragged. Dean's heart tightened as he thought of Aisha. Burrow had to abandon Zashite because of the emergency transfer. Would he abandon Aisha as well? He couldn't hold back anymore. He raised his fist and pounded the metal cabin. Bang! Bang! His fist struck the metal cabin, causing it to tremble slightly. The feeling of hauling suddenly disappeared. Dean felt the metal cabin was leveled, and he immediately stopped smashing. With a click, the cabin door opened, and the white-clothed Dana looked at him with a murderous expression. "Didn't I tell you not to make a sound and not to make a sound? Do you want me to cut off your arm?" Dean didn't care about her threat and hurriedly said, "You want to transfer, right? Can you take Aisha, the corpse king, with you? As long as she's here, I promise to cooperate with all of your experiments." "Dream on," white-clothed Dana said without even thinking. "There are so many things to bring, where would we have the strength to bring a corpse king? You." Dean's eyes were as cold as a knife. He looked at her ferociously. "If you don't take her with you, I promise you won't get any benefits from me. You dare to threaten me?" Dana raised her eyebrows and raised her hand, ready to teach Dean a lesson. "Forget it." At this time, Boluo's cold voice came from not far away. "Bring her along. It doesn't matter if we lose one. Moreover, she does have some research value." White-clothed Dana heard his words, and the killing intent on her face disappeared. She nodded respectfully. "I know, Dad." After that, he glanced at Dean in the metal cabin and snorted, "I warn you, if you make any noise again, I will cripple your arm. I will forgive you this time." After that, he didn't wait for Dean to open his mouth and slammed the door shut. Dean was relieved as he looked at the closed cabin door. Aisha should be fine with Burrow's words. Aisha should be fine. She should. He clenched his fists slightly. He wanted nothing more than to smash this metal cabin and rush out to kill all of them. However, his body was too weak. Even though he was filled with anger and killing intent, he could only lie there sullenly. After taking a few deep breaths, Dean gradually calmed down. He changed his posture and continued to listen to the metal cabin. The metal cabin was moved. In the shaking, Dean felt that the metal cabin seemed to be going upstairs. It didn't take long for the metal cabin to be put down again, and the surroundings returned to silence. He tried hard to listen, but couldn't hear the slightest sound. After an unknown period of time, he once again heard the rustling sounds of collision, as well as the indistinct sounds of conversation, but he couldn't hear them clearly. After about an hour or so, Dean suddenly felt the ground tremble gently. It seemed that the earth was shaking. Then he heard heavy thumping sounds coming from the ground outside the metal cabin. It seemed that a giant beast was trampling on the ground. It didn't take long for the thumping sound to stop. Dean felt the metal cabin was lifted, shook a bit, and then stopped. It seemed that it was placed on top of something. It was another long wait. In a trance, Dean suddenly felt that the metal cabin was shaking slightly, but he couldn't hear anything. However, he felt his body was weightless for a moment, as if he was flying. It was still quiet outside, but Dean could hear one or two roars from time to time. They were low and vigorous, which was not the sound that human vocal cords could make. Dean listened attentively, but the metal cabin's soundproofing effect was extremely strong. Even if he put his ear on the metal cabin, he could only hear some relatively loud sound. When a beast roar came from a distance below him, combined with the vibration of the metal cabin, Dean guessed the situation outside. The migration seemed to have begun, and they were taking the air route. I don't know if the pursuers can find the traces left by him. I didn't hear the explosion before, so the underground base shouldn't have been destroyed. Dean's eyes flashed slightly, but he wasn't happy at all. With Burrow's cautiousness, the possibility of leaving the underground base was extremely low. Even if the base was empty, there would always be clues. If it was him, he would bury some means in the base to make the pursuers disappear together with the underground base. In the following time, the outside fell into a permanent silence. In addition to the occasional strange roars and bumps, Dean felt that he was moving, but no other sound could be heard. Slowly, Dean felt the hunger. It seemed that 4 or 5 hours had passed. His mood was complicated, sometimes resentful, sometimes disappointed, sometimes hopeful. He resented the fact that the white-robed Dana had deciphered the secrets of the battle armor so quickly, and was disappointed that the pursuers hadn't been able to find him even after so many days. He was hoping that the expert who had come would be evenly matched with Burrow. Only then would he be able to take advantage of the chaos and escape. As these thoughts intertwined with each other, his mood became more and more gloomy. This was because he knew that only a loser would have such messy thoughts. Only when one was forced to a dead end and had no way out would they blame others for their failure and entrust their salvation to others. While Dean was thinking, the metal cabin suddenly floated, as if it was falling at a very fast speed. Dean's thoughts scattered and his heart was shocked. He grabbed the cavernous material inside the metal cabin. His heart was both nervous and excited. Did the pursuers come? Bang! Suddenly, a violent vibration sounded. Dean's body was jolted along with the metal cabin, and his head hit the cavernous body inside the cabin. The elasticity was too strong, and he almost twisted his neck. He moved his neck and immediately put his ear to the metal cabin to listen. Ka! The cabin cover suddenly opened. The light shone in. Dana was standing at the edge of the metal cabin, looking down at Dean. Dean was still listening to the outside. He felt a trace of embarrassment, but soon restored his indifferent look. He quickly glanced outside the cabin cover and saw a greenish-brown neck. It was like a giraffe, but the neck was much thicker and longer than a giraffe's neck. Dean immediately sat up and took the opportunity to look at the outside environment. In addition to the greenish-brown neck monster, there was a dense forest around. Sure enough, this was not the underground base. Dana saw Dean's hurried look, and her face showed more disgust. She kicked the metal cabin. What's there to look at? It's because of you that we have to continue to drift. Dean didn't pay attention to her. After seeing the surrounding wilderness and sparse forest environment, he immediately looked for Aisha's figure. He saw that the metal cabin he was sitting in was tied to the back of the greenish-brown behemoth. The behemoth's body was incomparably huge. Just its slender neck alone was about a meter in diameter. Its back was wide and filled with all kinds of equipment in the laboratory. Most of these equipment were wrapped to prevent them from being damaged. Dean saw Dana in scarlet robe and another Dana in animal clothes on both sides of the monster's back. As for Dana, who was first captured and tortured by him, she was soaked in a glass-like container. Half of her body was still incomplete, but the lower part of her waist and abdomen had grown a lot, and the embryonic form of a thigh was faintly visible. Dean soon found Aisha's figure in a pile of miscellaneous instruments. Her body was tied up by ropes and wrapped around a relatively heavy instrument. She was still standing as straight as when they parted, motionless and expressionless. Dean was relieved to see that she was unharmed. It seemed that Burrow kept his promise. At this time, a low roar came from the side. Dean turned around and saw a giant monster standing in the sparse forest dozens of meters away. It looked like a lion with snow-white wings, but its abdomen had long, curved, jointed legs like that of a spider. At this moment, the giant monster was chewing something in its mouth, and blood was squeezed out from its teeth from time to time. On the back of this giant monster were a lot of instruments, and some of them were wrapped in animal skin, so he couldn't see what was inside. I didn't expect that such a fierce beast would be hidden in the underground base, and it has been domesticated. Dean secretly thought. Hey! At this time, Dana threw something to Dean. Dean raised his hand and caught it. It was a piece of fried and sealed meat. Hurry up and eat. We'll continue our journey after the big guys finish eating. Dana rolled her eyes and said impatiently. Dean didn't need her to say it. He knew to replenish his body with food. He asked while eating, "Where are we going? Are we drifting aimlessly?" "Why do you care?" Dana coldly snorted. Dean wasn't angry and continued, "The experiment can't continue if we keep drifting aimlessly like this. Why don't we sneak back to the War God's Wall and find a secluded place? After the experiment is completed, we can directly kill our way to the Empire. Isn't that better?" "Idiot." Dana's face was full of disdain. "Do you think it's so easy to cross the War God's Wall? If it's just the few of us, of course we can sneak back. But with you and these things, how can we sneak back? Do you think the warriors on the war god's wall are cowardly and incompetent like you? Dean ate the meat in his hand and said lightly, If I didn't run away, how could your father meet me? If he met me, how could he do the experiment? Dana snorted and said, You're only worth this much. Same here. Dean indifferently said. Dana glared at him. Do you want to ask for a beating? Dean looked at her raised palm and his eyes turned slightly cold. But in the end, he resisted and turned his head. He didn't talk to her again. It's almost time. Get ready to go. At this time, Bielello, who was sitting on the head of the green-brown neck beast, passed the message. He didn't look back but looked into the distance and said, Hurry up and try to reach the eastern continent by tonight. Yes, Dad. Dana said respectfully. She pulled Dean's metal hatch cover with her small hand. The cover almost hit Dean's head. Chapter 977. Roar. With the low roar of the giant beast, it set sail again. Dean was lying in the metal cabin. Burrow's words, Eastern Continent, made his imagination run wild. It didn't take long for Dean to hear a chirping sound coming from afar. It was getting closer and closer, getting clearer and clearer. Even through the metal cabin, he could feel the noise. It seemed that thousands of birds and beasts were attacking in a flock. Dean was shocked. He felt that the metal cabin suddenly shook and tilted to one side. It seemed that the greenish-brown long-necked giant carrying him and the cargo was turning at a very fast speed. Was it attacked? Dean was surprised and happy. He listened carefully for a moment, but didn't hear any sound. He was surprised. Was it not the pursuers? Soon, he thought of the Thunderbird in the sky of Shenluo Empire. And this greenish-brown giant beast happened to be flying high in the sky. Did it mean that there was a flock of birds similar to the Thunderbird that lived in the clouds? Thinking of this, he was nervous. He was not worried that Burrow would be defeated, which would lead to their annihilation. He was worried that Aisha, who was tied to the back of the greenish-brown long-necked giant, would be injured. The sound of the cry was getting louder and louder. The soundproofing of the metal cabin suddenly became a bit weak. Dean estimated that if he was outside, he might not be able to hear it clearly even if he shouted loudly. Through the distribution of the cry, Dean's mind emerged the picture of the greenish-brown long-necked giant being surrounded by a group of ferocious birds and beasts. At this time, Dean heard the sound of birds chirping. There was a sharp and loud sound which seemed to be a command. There were also panicked bird cries. It was obvious that Burrow and the other Danas had made their move. Bang! Bang! Dean suddenly felt the metal cabin was hit. The cabin cover was slightly dented. He was shocked. He didn't expect the attack from outside to be so violent. Soon, the sound of the impact was replaced by screams. It didn't take long for the sound of the cry to be more intense. The metal cabin was hit from time to time, and the dents were very sharp. It seemed that it was hit by a sharp weapon. Crack! With another impact, the gap on the side of the metal cabin cover suddenly broke, and the buttons were bounced off. The cabin cover was blown out by the strong wind, and the light shone into the darkness for a moment. At the same time, the roar was 10 times stronger than before, piercing the eardrums. Dean felt like he was in the center of a tornado, and couldn't hear anything. The first thing Dean saw was the overwhelming dark red giant birds and beasts, completely surrounding them. The scorching sun at 3 o'clock in the afternoon was completely blocked by these birds and beasts. Whoosh! The sound of something piercing through the air could be heard. Dean hurriedly looked back and saw a huge bird with dark red feathers flying over with its sharp claws. This bird beast was nearly 5 meters tall, and its sharp claws could easily lift a person. Get lost! A white shadow flashed in front of Dean's eyes, and a snow-white gorilla-like upright monster flew out. Its body was nearly 3 meters tall, and it had 6 arms. It grabbed the bird beast's claws and wings and punched its head. Bang! The head exploded on the spot, and blood sprayed everywhere. Dean saw the gorilla monster covered with snow-white hair, and saw that its face was a bit like Dana's. He smelled the familiar smell, and immediately understood that it was Dana in white. Dean no longer looked at her, and his eyes searched for Aisha's previous position. He saw that she was still tied to the heavy cargo instrument, and her body was motionless. She turned a blind eye to the disaster in front of her. Dean was relieved to see that she was safe and sound, and then secretly took a breath. Once she was in danger, he would issue an order to let her save herself. Even if there was a chance, he would let her take him to escape together. Although Belle was not by his side, but he had already envisioned a similar desperate situation, and preset a second way of command, whistling. However, what worried him was that the surrounding was so noisy. Could his whistle reach Aisha's ears? "You go first, I'll bring up the rear." Suddenly, a low, hoarse voice came, as if a demon had awakened from the abyss, full of unspeakable gloom and horror. Dean followed the voice and saw a figure with curved horns on its head and 12 black wings on its back soar into the sky. Its body was nearly 3 meters tall, and its skin was dark and green, but it still maintained the appearance of a human, and it looked very much like the posture of a fallen angel in the myths. Dean's pupils shrank. What kind of magic mark is this? The next moment, the demonized 12-winged burrow rushed into the surrounding flock of dark red birds. Its towering figure was like a black scythe, and with a light swing, 7 or 8 dark red feathered birds were beheaded from the neck, and the cut surface was incomparably smooth. Dean saw that Burrow was holding a black giant sword in his hand. The sword was very wide, like the big sword used by the shield warriors in the Hunter Mercenary Corps. This is demi-demonization? Dean was shocked to see this scene. These dark red feathered birds were extremely fast, no less than a dominator, but in front of Burrow, they were like static dolls, and he could do whatever he wanted. He rushed into the flock of birds like a black blade, and all the birds along the way exploded. When the surrounding birds were cleared, the greenish-brown long-necked behemoth immediately let out a low howl, like a sob or a roar, and turned around, flying to the other side where the flock of birds was sparse. Dean glanced at the greenish-brown long-necked behemoth's head, and his pupils suddenly shrank, and he almost bit his tongue. On the head of this behemoth, there was a human face with clear facial features. However, the skin of this face was the same as the greenish-brown skin on its neck, extremely rough, with many small lumps, but the facial features were undoubtedly that of a human's. "Lower your head." Suddenly, a loud shout came. Dean's heart trembled, and he quickly shrank his head and climbed into the metal cabin. He saw a shadow pass over his head, and at the same time, he felt a faint burning sensation. This bird was actually emitting an extremely high temperature. Dean secretly thought that it was a close call, and turned to look, only to see Dinah, whose whole body was covered in snow-white fur like a snow ape, flying over. In a few strides, she grabbed and tore apart another bird that was attacking Dean, and blood rained down. On the other side of the greenish-brown long-necked behemoth, a blood-red spider-like figure was fighting with the birds that escaped the net. There were black patterns on its body, and its movements were agile. The spider's legs bounced, and it easily pierced through the birds like a few sharp spears. In the rear, 12-winged Burrow blocked the flock of birds, its black wings shooting feathers from time to time, piercing the eyes or neck of the birds that crossed the line. Some were seriously injured, and some were killed on the spot. After retreating for 4 or 5 minutes, the flock of birds was still chasing relentlessly, and hundreds of them were killed or injured. At this time, a high-pitched sound suddenly came from the chirping of birds, and then he suddenly felt that the surrounding birds were quickly reduced, and they all retreated. "Ready to go?" Dean's eyes moved slightly, and he was both relieved and a little regretful. But soon, Dean felt that the situation was not right. The birds slowly gathered, forming a large dark cloud behind him. To be precise, it was a dark red cloud, as if blood was seeping out of the cloud. Dean suddenly felt that the surrounding temperature was a little hot, and it was getting hotter and hotter. In less than half a minute, he felt that the temperature had risen to the point that his skin was burning. His face changed slightly, and he saw that the flock of birds had changed dramatically. If it was still dark red before, then now it was already crimson. The feathers of each bird had become incomparably bright, and the remaining black had faded, becoming bright red like blood. Whoosh! When one of the wings of one of the birds was ignited, it was as if a fuse had been lit, and all the wings of the birds continued to emit flames. This flame extended more and more, wrapping the entire bird, and in the blink of an eye, it turned into a firebird, and the entire flock of birds had also turned into a sea of fire. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.